potentially in all care homes in the right setting for dementia patients, but obviously it requires a level of investment both by the Scottish Government and by the care home providers.
That ends topical questions. Before we come to the debate on veterans, I would like to say that I am deeply disappointed that a major policy announcement to be made as part of the debate has found its way into the media before being announced to the Parliament. This is particularly unfortunate, as party business managers have worked closely together to ensure that the Parliament can come together on the wider issue of veterans. As the Government has sought the Parliament's consent to have a debate on the issue of veterans, it is not unreasonable to expect that any announcements relating to that debate are made first in the Chamber. Ultimately, the Government remains responsible for the management of information concerning announcements that fall to be made in the Parliament. My expectation is that the Government will reflect on how this particular announcement has been handled and that they will take steps to ensure that a situation like today's does not recur in the future. We now move to the debate on motion number 8747 in the name of Keith Brown on veterans, and I'll give a few moments for members to move their seat. I now call on Keith Brown to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Can we get the Minister's microphone on, please?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I obviously note the comments that you made about the release of this information. We did try very hard to make sure it didn't happen. Obviously, it has. And as you've said, we will reflect on how we managed to avoid that in future. I did, once the information had appeared in the public, send out a briefing note to opposition members to make sure they were aware of as much information as possible, but obviously regret the release of that information. Presiding Officer, as Scotland prepares to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice during the Great War, we should also pause to remember those who returned from that war injured and, in many cases, broken in other ways, if not just physically. They believed that they would return home to a land fit for heroes, and instead they came back, by and large, to poor housing, the prospect of unemployment and very little in the way of welfare support. Of course, ours is a very different society today, and while we strive to do more, those leaving the armed forces today have access to a very wide range of support and services. But in one vital respect, that earlier generation arguably had a factor in their favour, and as far as that conflict and also the number of people serving in that conflict in this country had a much more commonly held experience. So it was an experience the horrors of which were shared with on a much larger scale than those who serve today and come back to join civic society. Experience of active service is shared by far fewer people today, and of course that's a matter for a successful reflection on the extent to which we managed to avoid wars of the scale that we've had in the earlier part of the last century. But that also provides a very strong reason why we must continue to provide particular support to veterans today. Many have experienced conflict of one sort or another, and they've served with honour and pride and given up many of the individual freedoms which we take for granted, and we, not just for that but for other reasons as well, owe them a debt of gratitude. Our veterans are by and large innovative, hard-working, entrepreneurial and civically minded people, and they generally play a very full part in making Scotland successful. Veterans Scotland estimates there are around 400,000 veterans in Scotland, and that's almost 8% of the population. Indeed, around 2,000 service leavers return to civilian life annually in Scotland, and many make that transition relatively seamlessly. But a small number do face particular difficulties that require our support. And in some cases, we have to make sure that they get special treatment to recognise the special circumstances that they've had to endure. And I make no apology for taking that kind of action. In 2012, the Armed Services Advice Project, ASAP, which is an excellent project, reported that while veterans often have similar support needs to the wider population, the experience of serving can result in multiple and complex needs. And these can range from welfare to benefits, accessing benefits, getting back into employment. They can relate to health issues or indeed to financial or debt issues. but the cause can often be traced back to the veteran's initial transition to civilian life. And the ASAP report also noted that in spite of the support and advice that was available, too many veterans in Scotland slipped through the net. And in some cases, they continue to experience problems resulting from that unsuccessful transition for many years after leaving. That's why getting it right at the first point of transition is so important. And it's quite clear that the current transition process is failing some of our veterans. I think this is particularly so for early service leavers who are not eligible for the full MOD resettlement package offered to those with over 4 years' service. Presiding Officer, in my previous role I served in an education capacity, and I remember the issues and discussions that we had at that time about transition from primary school to secondary school. And I'm not saying they're completely analogous to the transition that people make from military life to civilian life, but there is a fairly substantial change which takes place, and some of the issues are similar, and it's really important that we get that right. The early service leavers who I talked about account for half of all those transitioning to civilian life in a given year, and some find themselves ill-equipped to cope. The transition mapping study produced by Forces in Mind Trust last August projected the cost of poor transition across the UK to rise to £122 million in 2013. Much of the responsibility for meeting the needs of service leavers in Scotland falls to the Scottish Government and to devolved public services. And it's a responsibility we take very seriously, and we are committed to ensuring they receive the full range of support. Had we the full range of powers, we would design a holistic framework of support running seamlessly from enlistment to transition. But transition is currently the responsibility of the UK Government. And I've seen the way that can be done when I talk to people in Canada who are involved in that process, but they have that holistic view of people that are serving and moving into civilian life as well. And I've said to many UK ministers over a number of years now that they really should, on the very first day that somebody joins the services, start a plan at that stage for return to employment and housing provision when that person eventually leaves the service. I do look forward to seeing the outcome of the UK Government's Veterans Transition Review, which we expect to report in February. And I've made my views known to Lord Ashcroft on the failings of the current system of transition, and we've shared some suggestions for concrete improvements. Working within our devolved powers, our priority remains to remove any disadvantage faced by our veterans in accessing public services in a way that suits their unique circumstances. Indeed, Lord Ashcroft's team had indicated that the support provided to those service personnel entering civilian life in Scotland is a model to be recommended. And in September 2012, we published our commitments, detailing Scottish Government support for the armed forces and veterans, covering health, education, housing, justice and sport. And that paper was widely welcomed by veterans' organisations, as well as the MOD and by the armed forces, who told us that our commitment set out the foundation of an ongoing and productive relationship with them. It reaffirmed our clear and unequivocal message that the armed forces, their families and veterans remain at the centre of our policy thinking, as well as our development and delivery of policies. And we've made substantial progress underpinned by substantial funding commitments. We've committed over £3.5 million to projects across Scotland, providing housing and support services for veterans and disabled ex-service personnel. We've implemented the recommendations of both Morrison reports, providing £2 million for a new national state-of-the-art prosthetic service and over £1.2 million funding per year for the provision of specialist mental health services. And we've improved access to NHS services, including to priority treatment through new GP forms, as well as the rollout of the CHI numbers to serving personnel and provision of a Veterans Health Zone on the NHS Inform website. And those successes have been made possible through working with our strategic partners, the NHS, local authorities and wider public bodies. And I'd like to pay particular tribute to the ex-service sector, Veterans Scotland and others who have played a vital role as champions, advocates and disseminators of good practice in representing the interests of veterans across Scotland. And that's why in November I announced that the Scottish Government would provide Veterans Scotland with capacity building funding of £220,000 over the next 2 financial years. And that, taken with the significant increase to the Scottish Veterans Fund, is further evidence of our wholehearted support for those who have served. But we have to seek to do more, and in particular to help those veterans who still slip through the net. And I believe that the time is now right to step up our commitment and shape a response which addresses the distinct needs of veterans and supports public services to meet expectations for them. And having reflected on the models I've seen in Canada and elsewhere, I'm pleased to announce the creation of the new Commissioner dedicated to veterans. And the Scottish Veterans Commissioner will have a broad remit which will take an overview of support services across Scotland. Through thematic inquiries, the Commissioner will identify the need for and the changes and help to drive the changes that will enable those services to better support veterans. And we have to ask the question, why are some veterans still struggling to access the help they deserve? Where are the gaps? What more can we do to meet our obligations to those who have served? And as I've said, to make sure at the first point a veteran tries to access public services, whether it's the council, the government, the health board, that they get the right response at the right time, because if they don't, and we've found that in the past, many will not come back to seek that support. So, working with partners, the Commissioner will bring renewed focus and momentum to our ambition to develop leading-edge support for veterans across our devolved responsibilities. And the Commissioner's recommendations will help build leadership and direction around veterans policy, in partnership, crucially, with the strong ex-service sector. The unique role of veterans' organisations across Scotland will be pivotal to this, drawing on the expertise and the evidence of the Royal British Legion Scotland, Poppy Scotland and others to capture the experience of veterans themselves. The veterans' perspective will be fundamental to the work of the Commissioner, informing both investigations and recommendations for improvement. But it's not a complaints arbitration service. Will ensure that the Commissioner's remit does not duplicate the functions of the Scottish Public Services, Ombudsman and others. We will take the time to listen and take on board the views of key partners, especially Veterans Scotland, to help shape the Commissioner's remit and work programme before the post itself is advertised. Presiding Officer, I have set out what we have done to support our veterans to date and how, through the development of a Scottish Veterans Commissioner, we now propose to do more. We will continue to work with veterans charities and public sector providers to ensure we meet the aspirations and expectations of Scotland's veterans. And I move the motion in my name.
I now call Mark Griffin. Mr Griffin, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity to speak in the Chamber on the subject of Armed Forces veterans and the vital support services and charities that operate in Scotland and throughout the UK. From the outset, I'd like to acknowledge, as in the Government motion, the debt of gratitude that Scotland owes to those who have served in defence of freedom, and to put on record the continued support that we on this side of the Chamber give to our Armed Forces personnel and veterans. As such, we will be supporting the Government motion at decision time, and we welcome the announcement of a Veterans Commissioner. And I note the comment from the Minister on the early release of that announcement. What I would say is, perhaps if that announcement had been included in the motion that all parties agreed on, then we would all have been able to support that announcement, not just on the record through the official report, but at decision time tonight. And I note the comments from the Presiding Officer too, but being a member of the Armed Forces, particularly during times of conflict, is immensely stressful beyond anything I think that we can imagine. What that stressful situation creates is a level of commitment and an intense bond amongst service personnel that's unique to our armed forces in this country. I could only listen and trying to work out in my head when hearing from a soldier who had served in Afghanistan what it was like to come under fire and that pressure and lose a fellow soldier who was as close to him as a member of his own family. I can only imagine how isolated someone must feel if they are discharged from the armed forces into society alone and perhaps with no family after having such a close bond to the comrades that they fought with, and then return back to the UK with, but perhaps are living at much larger distances than what they previously were. Like, going from living in such close quarters with people you considered family, eating, sleeping, working, socialising with that same group of people, to then be discharged into a community of strangers who tend not to understand military life and the bond it creates, particularly with the point the Minister makes about the number of people experiencing that military life fallen from the early part of the previous century. Now, the majority of servicemen and women make a successful transition to civilian life, but it really isn't hard to imagine why some of our veterans struggle. This can put a massive strain on family life for those struggling to adapt. For those without family, civilian life must feel like possibly the loneliest place in the world. Now, all those reasons mean that it's of vital importance that the advice and support services are in place for former service personnel to adjust to living in mainstream society, and that we support those plans to coordinate and deliver support and advice services from the private, public and voluntary sectors for ex-service personnel and their families. Now, there are too many fantastic organisations providing support and advice to ex-service personnel and their families to mention and do justice to all the work they do in our speech in Parliament today. But I'd like to mention some, the first of which could give us the experience of what being an armed force reservist actually involves. And I've mentioned this organisation before, and that's SABRE, supporting Britain's reservists and employers, and they have area committees up and down the country here in Scotland, and that's an organisation that gives advice and information on the extra skills a reservist can bring to an organisation and encourage employers to look more favourably at employing reservists. They can give the employer a first-hand experience of the sort of training a reservist will get, and they hold regular employer weekends where members here could go and experience that sort of training our reservists get. I'd be happy to give out local contact details for area committees if anyone would be interested in that. Now, we have to continue to support those sort of organisations which do tremendous work for former service personnel across Scotland too. That includes the Royal British Legion, who I visit regularly. And the Legion provides practical care, advice and support to armed forces personnel, ex-service men and women of all ages and their families. And it also runs the Poppy Appeal annually. And recent appeals have emphasised the increasing need to help the men and women who are serving today, as well as ex-service people and their dependents. The Legion also assists any serviceman or woman to pursue their entitlement to a war disablement pension, and every year up to 200 ex-service personnel in Scotland are represented at war pensions tribunals. We have the Scottish Veterans Residencies just across the road from the Parliament, who provide residential accommodation to over 300 ex-service personnel and their partners, and have helped tens of thousands of veterans throughout Scotland since they were established in 1911. There's the Soldiers, Sailors, Airmen and Families Association, whose Lanark branch covers the Central Scotland region, and they offer financial, practical and much-needed emotional support to current and previous members of the armed forces and their families through services like Forces Line, a telephone service entirely independent from the military chain of command, to provide supportive listening and advice, and a specialist absent without leave advice line. And they also run Forces Additional Needs Disability Support Group and organise children holidays run by volunteers, which concentrate on offering experiences and activities which children with additional support needs would not normally have access to. Finally, last one I would touch on would be Erskine, the leading provider of care for veterans in the country, providing care across a wide range from respite and short breaks, residential and nursing care, dementia care, palliative care, physiotherapy, speech and language therapy and rehabilitation care. Vital services for ex-service men and women and their families. The Presiding Officer, I hope that the newly announced Veterans Commissioner will be able to build on that tremendous work already taking place in our veteran community and support the many organisations which provide the essential services to people that we owe such a large debt to, and that Commissioner will be able to bring together the wide array of services that perhaps operate in pockets of communities and make sure that veterans right across Scotland are getting access to those fantastic services. Thank you.
I now call on Alex Johnson. Mr Johnson, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by thanking the BBC for advance sight of the Minister's statement. And while I say that in a fairly light-hearted way, I have to say that there is a serious issue here, but we must not allow that issue to get in the way of the unanimity that exists across this chamber. And it's with that sense in mind that I rise to support the motion in the name of the Minister. In fact, I'm delighted also, as other members will be, to welcome the management team of Scottish Veterans Residences to Parliament today. They are actually in the public gallery. Scottish Veterans Residences are one of several veterans housing charities operating in Scotland who offer a range of housing options to veterans, with Scottish Veterans Residences currently driving forward an innovative and much needed development in Glasgow. As some members may be aware, with an Army veteran in my own office, I've had no alternative but to keep a keen interest in veterans' issues over a number of years now. And in 2012, I was delighted to sponsor a reception on the issue, which the Minister himself kindly attended, along with many other MSPs. For most service personnel, the move from military to civilian life is a smooth one, although many veterans have told me that it can be more of a culture shock than they envisaged. For some, however, their military service or even underlying health issues that were previously undetected means that they face greater challenges adjusting to their situation. Although each veterans housing charity often specialises in different needs, the fact that they operate under one umbrella and have a single application process demonstrates partnership working and a desire to deliver effective services to those who need them. Securing a home is a fundamental need for anyone, but veterans often require more than this, and given that it is estimated that over 70,000 members of the British Armed Forces have served in Afghanistan since 2001, and over 100,000 have served in Iraq between 2003 and 2009, then I'm sure that we can agree that specialist services for veterans will become increasingly important. Poppy Scotland have found that, compared with their English and Welsh counterparts, veterans living in Scotland are 10% more likely to become homeless. They're 8% more likely to suffer from mental health problems. They're 5% more likely to have financial problems, 5% more likely to have a criminal record, and 3% more likely to suffer alcohol problems. 1 in 5 of the Scottish population is a member of the veterans community, ex-service personnel or spouse or dependent of an ex-service person. Research shows that some 350,000 members of the veterans community have potential welfare needs, and I feel that it is important to highlight this. Yes, the support given to serving personnel making the transition from military to civilian life has improved considerably over the years, but too often a need for specialist support only manifests itself years after discharge. And that's why I'm glad to see that the growing recognition of our veterans may need our help well beyond they may need our help well beyond the initial phase of their civilian life. The issues that have been raised in this debate are important and they are varied. However, the proposal that's been made by the Minister in his opening remarks for a Veterans Commissioner is one that draws considerable interest and I wish to address directly. The Minister made it clear in his opening remarks, and I quite agree with the principle he set out, that in the past many veterans felt they were properly represented because there were in fact so many veterans within our elected parliaments and other bodies. That is no longer the case. However, my concern over the appointment of a Commissioner, not my opposition, you understand, is that we have been too quick to appoint Commissioners in the past. I believe that we are in a particularly lucky position in having here in our Parliament a Minister appointed to represent veterans' interest and a man who has a considerable level of military service himself. The concept of a Commissioner has worked many times in the past for other purposes, but that cluttered environment of Commissioners and Ombudsmen has required thinning in recent years. And the appointment of another Commissioner, if it is to be done, must be done with key objectives in mind. There is already an extremely complex, some would say a cluttered environment in this landscape for veterans in Scotland. And the ability to bring together specialist support is something which is already achieved by a complex landscape of charities and veterans representatives, including veterans champions across all our communities. For that reason, I would give some concern to that, but also express my concern over how this may be funded, and I would wish the Minister to explain how the funding arrangements will be dealt with. Because if this is yet to be funded through the corporate body of this Parliament, then we must consider how much better that money could have been spent on other priorities. So I think the Government still has to justify its call for a Commissioner to deal with these issues. The Minister has to explain to us exactly what that Minister will achieve that is not being achieved by those who work extremely hard in this sector already, and exactly what we can expect to see over the longer term. Because if this appointment, like some in the past, is an appointment which will gradually be subsumed into another responsibility and watered down, then it may actually have the effect of making things more complicated rather than more simple. So, with my qualified support, I look forward to hearing more answers on the part of the Minister and having a system in place that will deliver, whether we have a Commissioner or not.
We now move to the open debate. Speeches are 4 minutes. Jim Eadie, followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Armed Forces class a veteran as anyone who has given 1 day of what is called reckonable service. This may be because once someone has made the decision to sign up and serve in the military, they have made a profound and lasting commitment that goes beyond days, months and years, but is instead much like joining a new family. The transition undergone when someone leaves this family to a new future on Civvy Street can prove hard at times, as Mark Griffin and Alec Johnson touched on in their contributions. Many former servicemen and women describe the difficulty of finding their place in society without the shared sense of purpose and close bonds of friendship that they previously relied upon. This transition can be made more difficult to those who bear the physical or emotional scars of war, especially those who lose a limb and face the lifelong struggle towards rehabilitation. The Military Covenant recognises society has a moral obligation towards members of the armed forces for their service. By giving up their civil liberties and placing their lives in danger, our veterans are worthy of the utmost respect, as well as the highest possible standards of treatment and care. That is why I am pleased to use this debate to draw attention to the efforts of those working to rehabilitate military amputees, in particular the pioneering work of the South East Mobility and Rehabilitation Technology Centre, based in the grounds of the Astley Ainsley Hospital in my constituency. The SMART Centre employs over 70 professionals and is responsible for the ongoing care, rehabilitation and support to a quarter of all of Scotland's military amputees. And thanks to Scottish Government investment and the leadership which a dedicated Veterans Minister can provide, the facility will become the centrepiece of a new national approach to amputee care and will provide, as never before, a fully comprehensive rehabilitation service. The centre will have the capacity to fit and repair the next generation of high-technology prosthetic limbs and offer training and support to patients on how to live with their disability. The head of the service, Mr David Gow, has described this advance as a step change in the delivery of amputee care. In April 2012, I tabled a motion in Parliament congratulating the Daily Record on their investigation, revealing that as many as 1 in 10 of British Army soldiers are currently battling mental health issues, and many return to civilian life and have to cope with the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is for that reason that I am pleased that military amputees at SMART will have access to extensive peer-based support with specialist psychological input from trained professionals. Work is now underway to establish this service, and it is hoped it will be fully up and running by April of this year. Presiding Officer, just as it is my honour to highlight the terrific work of such organisations, I would also like to highlight the efforts of one particular veteran who continues to raise funds and awareness and contributes to a number of worthwhile causes, such as Edinburgh's Royal Hospital for Sick Children, where he has raised over £100,000, and for the Prestonfield Neighbourhood Workers' Centre, which provides a range of daycare services for older people in my constituency. At the age of 93, my constituent Tom Gilzane is a shining example and can be seen in many days with his trademark tartan trews on the high street of our capital city, raising funds for these good causes. He is a shining example of the very best virtues any veteran could hope to display. A decorated war hero, his tireless commitment to charity and selfless dedication towards helping others is an inspiration to all of us and is worthy of the highest recognition. In raising so much money for good causes, he has touched the lives of so many people. And he is an example to all of us and a credit both to himself and the veterans community. There is currently a campaign underway to see him awarded the Freedom of the City of Edinburgh. Presiding Officer, I can think of no person more deserving of such an honour.
Ken McIntosh, followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank the Government for bringing forward today's debate and for allowing the Parliament to recognise the contribution that veterans have made and continue to make to our country. The UK's involvement, as the Minister himself highlighted, the UK's involvement in armed conflict remains a highly contentious issue. But by contrast, it's very pleasing to note that public support for serving and former members of the armed forces seems, if anything, to be increasing. And as we move further away from the world wars that so shaped the history of the last century, I believe we have the opportunity to develop a new and, I hope, a healthier relationship with the military and with our military veterans. And I want to highlight 2 points in particular this afternoon. The need for us to encourage successive generations to remember the sacrifice made by so many so that in defence of our freedoms and our way of life, and the practical help and support we can and should be offering those who continue to serve. Now, in this anniversary year, when we look back at the momentous events which shaped the outbreak of the First World War, it's easy to be swamped by the sheer scale of the devastation that was wrought by the millions who died in that conflict. But sometimes it is the individual stories which can most make you stop and think. And that certainly was my reaction when I saw the work of the Mearns History Group in my own constituency, who have recently undertaken a project to research the background to all those in the local area who died in the Great War. Now, for more than 10 years now, on every second Sunday in November, along with every member here, I'm sure, I have stood reading the names on the memorial at Mearns Cross, and many, many times over wondering who these men were, what lives did they lead, who did they leave behind. And the local history group have done a wonderful job in finding out just a little of that story, behind each one and the grief that each family must have caused, it must have lost. Names on the memorial such as Andrew Hamilton, Private, 1st Garrison Battalion, Gordon Highlanders, a joiner who lived with his wife Elizabeth and their 6 children at 35 Main Street, Newton Mearns, and who died of nephritis in Rawalpindi, aged 39. Or Corporal Robert Close, 2nd Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers, son of Robert and Sarah Close, killed in the Somme, 16th July 1916, aged 25. I want to thank all of the volunteers in the local community who have taken the time to unearth these simple facts, but which allow us even now to make the connection to our war dead. But it's not enough simply to remember the fallen. We should use this moment, and this year's commemorations in particular, to help those still serving. And if I may, I'd like to draw the Minister's attention to a very worthwhile new initiative. Armed Forces Legal Action, or AFLA, is a nationwide scheme to provide discounted legal services for current armed forces personnel and those who have recently left. Lawyers up and down the country are being asked to offer a reduction of 1/3 of their fees and to extend that support to wounded veterans and bereaved partners. And to date, 117 law firms up and down the country have expressed an interest in registering. The scheme was the brainchild of a Scottish serviceman, and it's officially being launched on Armed Forces Day later this year. I'm pleased to be hosting a reception here in the Parliament, to which all members will, of course, be delighted. But if the Minister is interested in finding out more, I'd point him currently in the direction of the website of the Law Society of Scotland. I'm sure the Minister can recognise the advantages of such a straightforward, practical and supportive scheme, and I'd be delighted if he could offer his endorsement or that of the Government. And if I could end, Presiding Officer, on a slightly lighter note, I took advantage of a previous debate to enlist the support of the Minister's colleague, the Minister for External Affairs, in a fair trade football match. The Scottish parliamentary team is once more up against a team of Royal Air Force veterans in our annual fixture to mark Armed Forces Day. And before you get the wrong idea, they may be veterans, but they're fit, they're skillful, and unsurprisingly, they're very well disciplined. I know I can count on Labour's shadow spokesperson, Mr Griffin, here to shore up the back line. I also know from experience that the Minister is a very useful player, and he can see that we're counting on support. I hope he can maybe find a date in his diary in June, and I support the motion from the Government.
Thank you, Mr McIntosh. Methinks we're going to Miss John Park, Christina McKelvey, followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we all know The quote, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friend," but in our case it's one's nation. But do we really know the sacrifice we ask of our armed service personnel when we ask them to pay the ultimate price for our freedom and democracy? Do we truly understand the impact on any human being who has witnessed the horror of war? Do we take account of the impact on the families left behind to face an uncertain future, either without their loved one or with the duty to look after a damaged or injured loved one? Do we really understand that for some, the battlefield becomes Civvy Street? Citizens Advice Scotland has published a report called Civvy Street, the New Front Line. And it says in the report, the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have left an increased focus on the support needs of veterans and those still serving. In turn, this has led to better advice and training for those leaving the armed forces and better support for those who experience problems after doing so. However, there remain some, as the Minister said, who slip through that net. And many veterans continue to experience real difficulty, especially in that transition period. But for some of them, for decades later. And I think my involvement in the firm-based Lanarkshire group has shown me very clearly how problems can arise years and years later. One of the things that I support, Presiding Officer, is the Armed Forces Advice Project. This was established in 2010 following a very successful pilot in my constituency in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. It provides advice and support for all members of the Armed Forces community, whether they are serving personnel, veterans or their families, and ASAP is delivered by the Scottish Citizen Advice Service. It's a very highly trusted network and it has decades of experience delivering a free, independent, confidential and impartial advice and information service to the general public. And they were extremely successful in the first 2 years of the project. They assisted nearly 1,800 clients with over 6,000 issues, and 84% of them were either veterans or their dependents. Some of them were actually still serving and needed some support with the transition out because they were finding that very difficult, and the ASAP project was able to deliver that too. As we see from the project, and I was very honoured to host a debate on that project a number of months ago, and we've seen very clearly the case studies that came from that people coming out from the armed forces and veterans have similar issues as everybody else, but it seems to be 10 times more difficult. And if that's a mental health problem or an ongoing injury and sometimes issues that are completely undiagnosed for years later, then people can find that extremely difficult to go and ask for that help. So ASAP provides that help. They give it on a very informal basis. They support people in the measures that they want, at the pace that they want to. But, Presiding Officer, to truly accept the responsibility we have and the duty of care we have for armed services personnel is to ensure that they have the best of care, and that when they come to the end of the service they have given, irrespective of the reasons for going to war and whether we agree with it or not, they should still get the high standard of care. That's why I welcome the announcement by the Minister today that a Commissioner, my opinion is a Commissioner will make and can make the difference between standard local authority in healthcare to high quality, consistent healthcare. And as an active member of Firm Base, I said I've seen a lot of that and how they address the needs. But the Minister will remember visiting with me Re-Employs Veterans Employment Project in Hamilton last year, where we heard first-hand the challenges faced by veterans to gain the support, and in some cases the challenge to admit that they actually need the support. And he will remember that consistency of service was one of the biggest challenges faced, and I believe the Commissioner will take steps to address any inconsistencies. Presiding Officer, I believe, like the other very good partnerships and collaborations the Scottish Government has with Veterans Organisations of Scotland, the new Veterans Commissioner, a first in the UK, will add to the very successful approach taken by our Minister in Scotland. And that our commitments paper demonstrates clearly that this SNP Government does understand the sacrifice, and we will do all that it can to provide the highest of quality of care and support.
Thank you. Can I just remind members that if they wish to speak in this debate, they should check that they have pressed the request to speak buttons. I call Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Nigel Doyle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate, and I'm pleased to be able to offer a few brief remarks. I think, as the motion rightly acknowledges, we owe a considerable debt to veterans, but I think the motion is also right to highlight the excellent work carried out by veterans organisations, others, many of them represented in the gallery this afternoon, that support veterans and their families in a myriad different ways. If I could draw on the experience briefly from Orkney, obviously an area with very proud military traditions. The Royal British Legion there has over 2,000 members in Kirkwall, a further 500 in Stromness, representing not just 8% of the population, but a full 12% of the population all told. It's a very, very active branch and club, providing a focal point for bringing the local community together, both members and non-members. I was fortunate enough to attend an event last year hosted by Veterans Scotland in Orkney, which was I think understandably well attended, but it was a real eye-opener for the likes of myself into the sort of issues faced by veterans transitioning out of the services. We've heard already from members about the issues around housing, joblessness, addiction issues, etc. But it struck me that many of these were very practical and based on the extent to which some of those exiting the armed forces can find themselves institutionalised and unable to cope with some of the things that we find very kind of mundane and straightforward. I think there are issues obviously around physical disabilities, but also, and I think Jim Eadie made this point very well, some of the issues relating to mental health issues, which also have a kind of stigma attached to them, may be difficult for anybody to deal with, but particularly for those with a services background. So I think because of all these reasons, the way in which services are delivered both locally and nationally is very important. It's not necessarily the case that those forces veterans can access them in the same way as those without that background. And I think a lot of good work is being done in that regard. Christina McKelvey's reference to the work of the CAB, I think, is one that I'm familiar with and certainly would echo those comments. But actually there is, I think, growing evidence that it isn't working as well as it could and as it should. But I would simply question whether or not the Commissioner is the right approach. And I found myself agreeing with some of what Alex Johnson was saying in that regard. I mean, leaving aside the issues around the way in which this news was broken and the lack of discussion with business managers in the preparation of this motion. These are all process issues. I think more substantively, there is a risk that in creating a Commissioner and the staff to support that role, that we see resources diverted away from direct help to veterans. Why not, for example, use some of the additional £250,000 to build capacity in Veterans Scotland and CAB and other such organisations? From conversations I've had locally in Orkney, there is a plethora of organisations all doing excellent work, but there's already confusion there. And I think Alex Johnson pointed to how there is a risk that all we do over time is exacerbate that. The Minister's right to highlight the continued problem in enabling veterans to access services and support, particularly at transitions. He may even be right that some means of bringing together the various organisations and agencies tasked with providing that support is required. But I don't think yet Parliament has been provided with the evidence to suggest the plan for a Commissioner is the answer. Any reassurances yet as to the office and the role will not divert much-needed funds away from building capacity in organisations already undertaking valuable frontline work with veterans and their families is needed. And I think we also need an explanation as to why, as Mark Griffin said, if this was or is such a good idea, it was not good enough to get into the motion being discussed with business managers, so we're clear what we're voting on this afternoon. As the Presiding Officer made clear earlier, debates and consideration of issues relating to veterans in this Parliament have been characterised by a genuine consensual cross-party approach. I recognise the very specific and direct insight that the Minister has in this area and agree with most of what he has had to say this afternoon, but I'm concerned that his proposal for a Commissioner does need more detailed scrutiny to ensure that we're making best use of the resources we have to assist those to whom we owe so much. Meantime, I welcome the opportunity to participate in this and discuss the debate this afternoon. I offer my assurance to Captain McIntosh that I will again be on duty in the service of this Parliament in our attempt to once again defeat the RAF comrades on the football field later this year. Thank you.
I think on that occasion I'll allow nicknames. I call Nigel Dawn to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all, welcome the announcement of a commissioner, because I think it actually is the right kind of step in the right kind of direction. I note that the Minister suggests that this commissioner would oversee the provisions for veterans and explore where the gaps are and why they're there. I think that is an extremely good idea, despite the fact that we seem to have a very joined-up landscape at the moment. I also note that the Minister suggested that he was actually going to consult on the Commissioner's remit, which I think actually is extraordinarily sensible, because that then means that some of the questions which I think have reasonably been asked about what's the Commissioner going to do can actually be dealt with in the remit that you give him or her when the time comes. Clearly, the transition in and out of the armed forces is something that some people do find extraordinarily difficult, and I think we understand why that might be the case. Clearly, it's also something that we should be seeing beforehand. Every time somebody moves into a new job, it should be obvious that at some point they're going to move out of that job, out of that position. And I do find it slightly extraordinary that the armed forces haven't worked out a long time ago that they need to find ways of transitioning their members out into civilian life. I noticed the government's existing commitments document published relatively recently, and its threefold approach to providing service men support and engaging with the community and providing personal services. I note also, in passing, Presiding Officer, that the White Paper makes a few observations about what we might do if we were really in charge of absolutely everything. And the two that I would point out at this stage are simply the idea that there should be no compulsory redundancies. The idea of getting your P45 on the battlefield does not appeal to me, and I don't think it appeals to anybody in this Parliament. And I also note the idea that we might review pensions, recognising that Scots, one way or another, don't seem to live for quite as long as others. And it seems to me as that undoubtedly applies to those who've been in the armed services. That's something else we should reasonably look at. Access to housing is one of those important issues that has only, I think, been briefly mentioned. And I'd like to highlight an opportunity that's in Carnoustie in Angus. And I notice here not so much a dodgy dossier as a dodgy picture of the Minister, who appears to be in charge of an extremely large piece of equipment, which I think had just demolished some houses. I hope he wasn't about to demolish those houses, which are, of course, to be replaced by new housing, some of which is specifically for veterans, which is the point. That is undoubtedly an extremely good idea for those who have been injured. Appropriate accommodation is indeed absolutely essential. Rushing swiftly on, though, I would like to pick up on the issue which some have already mentioned, and that is of mental health. I'm grateful to Mark Griffin for a new phrase. He mentions that members of the armed forces come out into a community of strangers. That's a new phrase to me, one which I think I will remember. Because as Christina McKelvey said, do we understand? I think the answer to the very obvious question is no. But one of the things that we also need to understand is a just get on with it attitude in the military, which I think we know where that comes from. But it does mean that those coming out maybe think they just need to get on with the difficulties in life. And actually they shouldn't need to. I have some really quite alarming statistics with which I think I would like to finish, and that is simply from the Falklands War, and these are MOD statistics, and I'm conscious the Minister had some involvement in that war, that there were just under 26,000 UK armed forces personnel there. Some 237 sadly died during the campaign. 1,335 had died since 1982 at the time of the report. But more importantly, from my point, 95 of those deaths were attributable to suicide or open verdicts. Now, that is the pointed end. That is the sharp end of mental health issues. And I don't think that issue is going to go away. There are many charities, including Combat Stress, who are already working on it. And I suspect that we are still seeing but the tip of an iceberg. Great number of these cases will come later in life as other traumatic events affect those veterans, and that is perhaps an issue which we will need to return to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Hans Al-Malik to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I am honoured to be speaking in this debate today, as veterans and veteran issues are very close to my heart, being an ex-TA soldier myself, serving in the 71st Royal Engineer Regiment Reserves and sponsored units as well. The first paragraph of the Armed Forces Covenant acknowledges that our armed forces and their families make huge sacrifices for our country. In return, we have the duty to give them and their families our respect and our support, especially when veterans sign up for the ultimate sacrifice for our country. That's the least we can do. Veteran issues are special for our thoughts, specific for our thoughts on war. We can strongly object and oppose a war, but once our troops are there, it is our duty to support them through whatever problems, difficulties they experience during their time there and on their return back home. I feel that we are failing our veterans. They are often left to rely on charity handouts, which in the current financial climate can no longer be guaranteed. And therefore, the appointment of a commissioner is welcome. However, I would like to see the commissioner, he or her have the powers to actually ensure that the actual support is given to the veterans for which he or she is going to be appointed for. Last month, I helped organize a curry night in the Mosque Kitchen restaurant in Edinburgh for the Soldiers' Charity, which is a fantastic organization. In 2013, they helped some 170 veterans in Glasgow, and the tune of £80,000 was spent for their well-being. Worryingly, they have seen their caseload rise over the last 3 years, and this is particularly important to note that the pressures on the charities currently supporting our veterans are in fact facing huge challenges. Therefore, Presiding Officer, I am happy to support the motion. I hope that the support for our veterans, that it mentions that we go on and ensure that we have a strategy in place which actually supports our veterans throughout the services that they normally look for. I have to say that one of the things I would look forward to in terms of the Commissioner's appointment is that he or she would make sure that in terms of our veterans' needs are looked after better than they currently are. A lot of our veterans are going through a lot of hardship. Their families also suffer with them, and that needs to change. And whilst I welcome the appointment, I welcome the resources to fund the Commissioner, what I don't see yet, and I hope I will see in the near future, is the strength and the powers given to the Commissioner to ensure that he and she will be able to carry out their job effectively, ensuring real support for our veterans. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. And I now call Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I too welcome the announcement of the Commissioner, and perhaps I can come back to that later on. Presiding Officer, I have a personal interest within the military, given that my daughter's boyfriend of about 2.5 years has just passed out as a Royal Marine just before Christmas, and I'd like to congratulate him on achieving that. I think esteemed following of the Minister himself, a former Marine. Presiding Officer, in 1915, the Scottish War Blinded Charity set up in Edinburgh. And it was a charity set up to take those from the front line who had been blinded by mustard gas. That charity has gone from strength to strength and continues to support and rehabilitate veterans, not just from recent wars such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, but veterans who have lost their sight due to age and perhaps infirmity as they grow older. Presiding Officer, the charity has changed with the times. And it's the change with the times that I think that the message the Minister is giving us today, that we have changed with the times. There is a recognition that our veterans require support, additional support. That additional support to perhaps be at the top of the list in terms of appropriate housing when they leave the forces. That additional support to ensure that GP support is there if they need it. That additional support to ensure that if they require hospitalisation for an illness or treatment, that it is there. Presiding Officer, the Commissioner, I believe, will be able to take those aspects and coordinate the many organisations and partnership working that already exists. Because, as I think Lee MacArthur said, there's a plethora of organisations out there, and sometimes that in itself can lead to confusion. So I would hope that the Commissioner will be able to take some of that confusion away and provide a coordination. In my own constituency, there is a charity called Horseback UK. And I believe it was Churchill who said that there's something about the outside of a horse which is good for the inside of a man. Now, this charity uses the horses to rehabilitate and enable personnel who have come back from conflict. Many have lost limbs and have gone through the arduous and sometimes very painful system of getting prosthetic limbs. But it's not been able to just use the limbs accordingly. It's been able to come to terms with the amputation. It's been able to come to the psychological aspect of having lost a limb and why. Horseback UK and the Minister visited Horseback UK, and there remains an open invitation for the Minister to return when the weather is perhaps slightly better, and obviously enjoy, I think, getting into the saddle along with some of the veterans and actually experiencing some of the work that goes on within the area. But Horseback UK are an integral part of the community in Aboyne and within West Aberdeenshire. They look at how they can facilitate something back into the community. It's a repayment, they say. It's about embracing their community. Most of the work is done outdoors, and they have school visits. They also provide training for the oil and gas companies to look at team building. So they're providing professional strands of training now through their disciplines they've learned through the military. It is giving purpose to many veterans who are struggling and continue to struggle with mental health. But it is giving them that real sense of purpose within the community. And I want to commend Jock Hutchison for the work he continues to do. Presiding Officer, I want to finish with saying that I was hoping that both Alex Johnson and Lee MacArthur would have welcomed the statement for the Commissioner and perhaps maybe asked the few questions of the purpose of the Commissioner and what they would hope that the role would actually look like, and perhaps pose those questions to the Minister. But can I finish by the words of Martin Gibson from Veterans Scotland? And he said, "I want to personally thank the Minister for the overall support and well-being of the veterans." I echo the words of Martin Gibson. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the closing speeches, and I call on Alex Ferguson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be concluding this debate on behalf of my party, and I would declare something of an interest as the convener of the cross-party group on armed forces veterans. And in both of these capacities, I very much welcome this debate, just as I welcome the interest that this Parliament has always shown in veterans and the issues they face since its very earliest days. That interest has been continued in a largely exemplary fashion by this Scottish Government in a way that has been welcomed by the armed forces and the veterans community, as has just been highlighted by Dennis Robertson. And I sincerely trust that this level of government support and interest will continue long into the future, no matter what party or indeed combination of parties form our future governments. The debt of gratitude that we owe to our serving and former servicemen and women, be they in their latter years or in their teens, demands no less, and the motion before us is right to highlight that debt right at the very outset. The motion is, I believe, also right to highlight the truly phenomenal role played by both veterans' organisations and local authorities' veterans' champions in helping to focus attention on the many and varied issues and challenges that our veterans face. Those challenges are quite easily highlighted by taking a quick glance at the agenda of the cross-party group over the last few meetings. We've looked at and discussed the Armed Forces Charter and the Scottish Government's Our Commitments paper. We've looked at the impact of the welfare reform programme on Scotland's veterans. We've looked at health and well-being issues, housing, the all-important transition from military to civilian life. We've looked at issues relating to veterans in custody. And in the rest of our programme this year, we will revisit housing, mental health and well-being and the Our Commitments paper. The cross-party group is very well attended and I think greatly valued by veterans' organisations, but I would dearly love to see more colleagues at the quarterly meetings. And for those in the chamber who have a diary with them, I would give notice that the next meeting is on the 5th of February. I look forward to seeing you there. Presiding Officer, the one sector that seems to have been slightly omitted from the motion, though certainly not by many members' contributions, is the voluntary charitable sector, whose efforts to help and support veterans is quite immense and invaluable in monetary terms. They range in size from well-known national organisations, such as Poppy Scotland, to very small charities run by individuals, such as South West Scotland R&R in my constituency, which organises courses of what I would call competitive recreation for young physically and often mentally damaged soldiers returning from war zones. And that charity simply aims to, and nearly always succeeds in, putting a smile back on the faces of these young people after the traumatic experiences that they've faced while on tour, experiences that were vividly highlighted by Mark Griffin in his opening contribution. Now, Presiding Officer, I have one particular reservation about the Commissioner's role, and I do share some of the reservations that expressed by Alec Johnson and Liam MacArthur. It is that he or she may be overly tempted to tinker with and over-formalise the work of this voluntary sector and the work of the smaller charities. I hope that will not be the case, but the temptation to do so will, I suspect, be there. It should be firmly resisted. And finally, and I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, to conclude on a slightly negative note, while I very much welcome the Presiding Officer's opening statement, I would register my own disappointment that the announcement of this Commissioner was leaked to the media before today's debate. That blatant bypassing of parliamentary procedure is something of a slap in the face for those who worked to ensure that we had a consensual motion before us this afternoon. I do not believe that it reflects on the personal efforts of the Minister at all, and I do not hold him responsible. But it does somewhat diminish the respect with which his government is viewed by the rest of the Chamber, and it has cast something of a cloud over an otherwise very worthwhile and consensual debate, which has included excellent contributions from all sides of the Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Mark Griffin. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would close the debate as I opened by restating the continued support that we give to our armed forces personnel and veterans. And I think it is telling that public support for our armed forces continues to rise, as pointed out by Ken McIntosh and Hans Malik, despite what some would consider contentious conflicts that not all members of the public support at all. And we do owe a debt of gratitude to members of the armed forces and veterans. We'll be able to mark some of the key events from World War I over the next few years. I met with Norman Drummond, the chair of the Scottish Commemorations Panel, who was able to outline the key dates and events to commemorate some of those events that have a particularly strong Scottish dimension, and I look forward to attending as many of those events as possible over the next few years, as well as that work at a national level to commemorate those events. There are local projects ongoing, again pointed out by Ken McIntosh, the Mearns History Group, who have been able to collate the records of the commitment of local people from the community who fought in World War I. Also, in my own region of the Croy Historical Society, who have compiled records, and I was able to make my own small contribution in that. I was passed on my great-uncle's soldier's Bible from the First World War, which was awarded to him and his regiment by the the Lord Provost of Rutherglen before they went on their service, and that's been my small contribution to that project. But those serving in our armed forces are asked to make the massive personal sacrifices in their human rights and ultimately give up their right to life in service of the nation, something that Christina McKelvey and Hanzala Malik pointed to, and that continued from the excellent debate that Christina McKelvey was able to secure in the Parliament to speak about the ASAP report that was welcomed right across the chamber. And it's only right that governments and ourselves as a nation value, respect and support our armed forces, and that culminates in the annual commemoration of Armistice Day, when we stop to remember those who have given their lives in action so that we can enjoy the freedom that we experience today. Those members of the armed forces falling back on that military covenant that governments in Scotland and across the UK and the wider public are able to show their support to members of the armed forces. Now, members might know that I spent some time in the Territorial Army, and I would have to say that I haven't had the same experience of that situation anywhere else in my lifetime. And while I went through all the training a reservist can, I didn't deploy to any military conflict zone because of university and other work commitments, but I can't even start to imagine that level of intensity and commitment to their fellow soldiers that those on the front line experience. Now, that experience of the front line means that coming back into society, that you often enter that community of strangers that Nigel Don flagged up from my opening statement, and that's what makes the Royal British Legion and other community focal points like the Legion who operates in Orkney, as Liam MacArthur flagged up, with such a large degree of community support, with 12% of the population being members, that organisations like the British Legion, with that focus on reintegrating members of the armed forces into community, break down that barrier of community of strangers. You're able to interact with people who've had the same experience as you, bring in people from the wider public. You're able to talk through a lot of the experiences you had in time through active service, and that understanding of the role and the pressure that you're under is spread much more widely throughout the community. Now, it's vital that those sort of community organisations and the advice and support that them and others provide, and it was raised on a number of occasions that the plethora of organisations was a term that was used, can sometimes be confusing to armed forces veterans, and that's what I hope the Veterans Commissioner will take that as his first action point, to address that plethora of organisations, to make his or her door a first-stop shop, effectively, for a veteran who's looking for a pointer to be put in the right direction towards the support services that they need. And I hope that that Armed Force Veterans Commissioner will be able to build on the work that local veterans champions who have been appointed in local authorities have been able to do. Areas like North Lanarkshire Council, who, off the back of having a veterans champion, have been able to amend their housing policy so that recognised the priority needs of homeless ex-service personnel and their families before they are discharged from the forces, so they can already have appropriate housing identified and prepared for them rejoining the community. I close there, Presiding Officer, by supporting the motion in the Minister's name, supporting the establishment of a Veterans Commissioner, and look forward to the consultation on his or her roles and responsibilities.
Thank you very much. And finally, I call on Keith Brown to wind up the debate. Minister, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm grateful to everyone that's spoken. There's been some very good contributions in terms of the knowledge and the insight, and some suggestions and some criticism as well. If I can try and address those points, especially those points of criticism, constructive as they've been. I think it is unfortunate that we do have that contention here, but it's obviously the case that whatever proposals are put forward by the government, they're open to criticism and to comment. That has to be the case. However, I did try to lay out when I first spoke what I thought were the answers to the two substantive points of criticism made by, I think, Alec Johnson and Liam MacArthur, which were really, I think, to do with two issues. One was remit and one was to do with resources. And I did say at the very start that not only are the resources which we are applying to this post new resources found from within Scottish Government, but not from within the Veterans budget. But in addition to that, we are also putting an additional around about £100,000, I think, into the capacity building, which I mentioned specifically, which is something that Liam MacArthur mentioned in his speech. We shouldn't do by putting money towards the Commissioner. So I thought we had covered that and thereby allowed ourselves to have what I'd hoped for was unanimous support for the Commissioner's post. However, in relation to the point about remit, I did also say that we intend to consult further, not least with Veterans Scotland and others. And if other members have suggestions to make, then I'm more than willing, of course, to listen to what those are. And the reason, one reason why it's specifically Veterans Scotland, to come back to a point that was raised by Alec Ferguson, is we do not see this role, certainly not my view, that this role should have an oversight view of those charities which comprise Veterans Scotland. I've made that point to Veterans Scotland, and I'm sure they won't come back with that as a suggested part of the Commissioner's remit. So I do see this as a very positive proposal. And I do think it's also true to say it's of a piece with what I think has been a pretty innovative approach of the government. First of all, we had the first Veterans Minister, in fact he's in the chamber just now, Stuart Maxwell, back in 2007. We had, established by Stuart Maxwell, the Veterans Fund, the first time that had happened in Scotland. We had the Our Commitments paper, which is a new departure and laid out the expectations on government and others to meet the needs of veterans. And as Alec Ferguson mentioned as well, we have the cross-party group, of which I've been involved in the formation of, and it's a great addition to this Parliament. So I think whether it's government or Parliament, over the last few years we've really upped our game in relation to veterans. And it's not the case that whenever we have a veterans debate we should all naturally just fall into a consensual mode. I've never thought that's the case, but I do think it would be useful to have consensus on the basis of the role that we expect the Commissioner to take up. And with those assurances in terms of resources, it will not be coming from other veterans activities. In fact, there's more money going into that. In addition, with the assurance on the consultation on the remit as well, then I'd hope we would be able to get to a position of unanimity afterwards. I should say that some of the comments that were made by Mark Griffin in relation to SABRE, I'm involved now and again, I would say fairly infrequently, attending my own local SABRE organisation, a very important organisation which looks after the interests both of reservists and also other parts of the armed forces as well. Many organisations which are mentioned, it would be invidious to mention two or three again, but if I could just mention one which was mentioned by a number of members, which was Scottish Veterans Residence, for the purpose really of saying thank you very much to Lieutenant Colonel Ian Ballantyne, who recently retired as the Chief Executive of that organisation. It just happens to be the case that he was my company commander when I served in the Falklands, but he's had a fantastic career since then and has now been succeeded by Phil Cox, who I'm sure will continue with the very good work that organisation does. As we set out in Scotland's future, irrespective of the outcome of the referendum, and going back to a point that Alec Ferguson made, there has been I think a fairly substantial degree of consensus and a very progressive approach by the Parliament and the various parties which comprise the Parliament towards Veterans Affairs. And I would hope that would continue regardless of either constitutional change or political change in future. And I believe that it will, not least because of the point made by, I think it was Ken McIntosh, that there does seem to me over the last few years to be an increasing appreciation of the role of the armed services. And people do seem to be able to divorce that appreciation from any views they may have in the conflict that they're serving, and that's a very welcome development, and we hope that will continue. I'm not going to go into the stuff about constitutional change, but there was one or two points made by Nigel Donn, and one in particular I think bears repeating, and that was in relation to the idea of no compulsory redundancies. Now that, you could say, is really a matter for, if the independence vote is yes, for the government to take that on. But the reason why it's important in this context is because that makes somebody a veteran by force. That makes them becoming a veteran much more traumatic. not least if you're serving on the front line and suddenly you're presented with a P45 and told you're no longer required. So that is why I think it was important to mention that. And we are committed to delivering better outcomes for those who, in many cases, have sacrificed a great deal to defend our freedoms across, and making sure that better deal is felt across all the devolved responsibilities that we have. And really, the post of the Commissioner is really to try and take that forward. My view, and as I say, we're still willing to listen to what others have to say on this, my view is that the very good things which are currently done can be pulled up to a higher level. And the point that Mark Griffin made about, I think, North Lanarkshire and what they've done in terms of housing. Now, I would hope the Commissioner will be able to see, well, actually looking at that, that's an excellent development, and why can't it happen elsewhere? Why is there not uniformity if that's what's required? And would it be easier for veterans who may have joined up in one location, maybe becoming a veteran in a different location, to have a better, a more uniform approach to the services that they require? It may not be the case, but it may be the case, and that kind of thing, I think, could usefully be taken up by the Commissioner. That's what I mentioned at the start, if you like, thematic inquiries into some of the provision that they currently have. So I think the Commissioner is of a piece with, I think, a fairly progressive approach that the government's taken. It's the first one to happen in the UK. The UK government itself has looked at the issue of an ombudsman, and we looked at that. And if I could refute the idea that this was done in a hurry, this has been developed over many months, a number of discussions, not least going to Canada and finding out what they've done in Canada. We haven't followed the same model in Canada. I think the comments that were made about the plethora of ombudsman-type positions is true, and we're not saying, as I've said in my opening speech, that this person should be responsible for taking up individual cases, although can listen to individual veterans. And it's also not the case, just to go back to another point that was made, that this will be paid for by the Parliament, this will be paid for by the Scottish Government. It's part of the veterans' activities that we undertake. So I think there's a real opportunity for us here to agree in the role of the Commissioner, and also to see if that Commissioner can start to make the kind of difference which, although it's not the same as the Ombudsman's role in Canada, has made that role in Canada has made a great difference to veterans in Canada. And it's my belief, from what I've heard from around the world, that it very much depends on the individual themselves who selected to do this. And the really important thing is not the statutory underpinning of this post. It won't be a statutory appointment in the way that Alec Johnson described. It will be an appointment made by the Scottish Government. But the really important thing is the standing this person has within the veterans community, and whether they're credible and they understand the issues which are at stake. As well as addressing the needs of veterans who are particularly disadvantaged, I'd also like to see the Commissioner develop a wider focus on unlocking the potential of veterans so that their skills and experience can be brought to bear for the benefit of all of Scotland. And I think most members here must have heard a veteran say to them, trying to look for a job and leaving the service, well, I'm not really qualified to do anything, completely unaware of the skills which they have and they've developed over a number of years in the services. So it's really incumbent upon all of us, and it will be upon the Commissioner, to make sure that we can make sure that people realise their potential when they rejoin civilian life. Just to say, in relation to some of the comments made about the First World War, in closing, and in commemoration of that, that in my own area I was asked to do a foreword for the study which was done on the War Memorial in Dunblane, and it was going through every individual that was on the War Memorial. The first person to lay a wreath at that War Memorial, I think in 1921, was a mother and father who'd lost 3 of their 4 sons in that conflict. And it was really interesting, just as the point that was made earlier on, to go through the individual stories of each of the people involved, because we often forget that. We'll see the names, but to find out they were part of a family, a community, and what their role was there is also very important as well. And just finally to say, in relation to other kinds of service, football, as Ken McIntosh mentioned, I did play against a services outfit before, and he said I was useful. I think it was just too slow to get out of the way and nearly severely injured one of the very fast service personnel that was playing against us, and also played, was happy to play against a Hearts legend. And he'd never a hard task to play against a Hearts team, admittedly, but was happy to play for against Hearts, who beat us, I think, 13-2. But it was Hearts have got a proud tradition, of course, with Erskine and all that goes with the history of Hearts as well. So I'm not sure I'll be there when it comes up next time, but I'll certainly be there in spirit. So if I can just close by recording my thanks again to the vast and very diverse array of veterans' charities. This is not about the charities. This is not about, some people have suggested this could be this Commissioner's role, about bringing them together or putting them into order. It's not about that. It's about something else entirely, just making sure the services are right. The charities do a considerable amount of work on behalf of veterans. They provide provide us advice, assistance and support, as well as signposting to services elsewhere, and they represent veterans at a local and national level, and they inform our policy thinking and development, which is a vital and invaluable role. I congratulate them on all their fantastic work. They support the estimated 400,000 veterans in Scotland, and they have our gratitude for doing that. And in conclusion, I am happy to move the motion in my name. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on veterans, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8732 in the name of Rob Gibson on the Scottish Government's consultation on its draft climate change adaptation programme. I'll give a few seconds for members to change seats. And I call on Rob Gibson to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Mr Gibson, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to formally move the motion in my name and crave your indulgence to try and get all of this detail in. Change and adaptation are rarely easy. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? None, because the light bulb has to be willing to change itself. And of course that should be an energy-saving light bulb now. Change and adaptation are central to meet the challenges of our changing climate. The Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee recently scrutinised Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. We heard evidence from stakeholders and from the Minister, and we wrote to him setting out our views and recommendations to inform the final adaptation programme. The committee thanks the Minister for his prompt and detailed response, which enables us all to consider that in this afternoon's debate. The committee fully agrees with the Minister that the long-term sustainability of Scotland in a changing climate is the responsibility of each and every one of us. As Morag Watson reminded us in a behaviour change session last September, when people are given the time and space to talk through certain things, all sorts of issues come to the fore. Culture change is possible. Also, the extreme weather we've experienced over the last few weeks reminds us of the urgency of a change of outlook. Can the Minister confirm that planning for a changed climate is being comprehensively embedded into Scottish Government policies? The RACI Committee work programme will focus our scrutiny of the forthcoming draft third national planning framework on how it will help deliver Scotland's climate change adaptation programme. The committee is pleased to hear that the Minister is soon to write to the Adaptation Subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change to formally request that it carries out the first independent assessment of the programme in Scotland, and we look forward to seeing that report. Further clarity is needed across all three adaptation programme themes with regard to project timescales, budgets and responsibility for development and implementation. Stakeholders want clarity whether project finance is secure or is still required to be found. Which is the lead organisation of implementation, and where a project is set to extend beyond the 5-year lifespan of the programme, how is its progress to be monitored? Presiding Officer, the committee strongly agrees that a longer-term view would significantly aid the building of Scotland's resilience. Will the Minister consider how this can best be achieved in the final strategy? The committee reiterates our appreciation of the vital work of our emergency and volunteer services in responding to extreme weather events. We would be interested to hear from the Minister what lessons have been learned to inform the final programme. Evidence mounts on risks facing our infrastructure and built environment from flooding, landslips and high winds. Also, our transport network and energy, information and communications technology are situated in strategic corridors and can be vulnerable. Compromises about the speed and effectiveness of emergency responses could impact on the continuity of businesses, health boards and local authorities, indeed the fundamental resilience of local communities. We recommend that the final programme be strengthened to set out how the planning process can be used to embed climate change adaptation, for example, on the siting of new developments and infrastructure, particularly in housing, renewable energy and rural broadband rollouts. The RACI Committee will inquire how the planning process takes climate change issues into account in its forthcoming scrutiny of NPF3. Presiding Officer, the importance of Scotland's key economic sectors, food, drink, tourism and energy, and their value to our economy are well known. All are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, not only here in Scotland, but also at an international level, which affects supply chains. Our final programme must line up with the adaptation plans of other countries to protect supply chains for our businesses, including airports and telecoms. And that requires international negotiation and discussion, much as our own Minister has done at the Doha round and later in terms of the Kyoto protocols, etc. They are absolutely essential in order that we make the contacts with other countries with whom supply chains are made. We welcome the Minister's assurance on how travel information and flood and weather alerts provided by Traffic Scotland, SEPA, local authorities and the emergency services are being shared through the internet, social media and radio. This must continue to be improved and developed in order to serve our communities. Smaller local businesses with shorter supply chains, especially in agriculture and seafood, are of profound importance to Scotland. We agree that more attention should be focused on supporting smaller businesses to adapt to changes in the climate. We were pleased to note the Minister recognises this, and we also welcome confirmation from the Minister that the Procurement Scotland Bill will in fact help support SME businesses to meet some of those changes in its work. The committee shares the strong concerns of agricultural sector stakeholders. The negative impacts of climate change are very real for them. Growing seasons have changed and farmers already have had to make and adapt what they grow. Farmers seem willing to make the changes, but a lack of knowledge transfer, practical guidance and financial incentives, they say, are needed. And I question whether these things will be available. Forestry faces the biggest challenges through the loss of confidence in making resilient decisions due to uncertain long-term effects of climate change and diseases and so on, which have been brought invasively to our country. Presiding Officer, the committee recommended that financial incentives such as the new SRDP and CAP are made user-friendly and adaptable and, wherever possible, have multiple benefits that also help deliver climate change adaptation and improve biodiversity. The final programme should support people involved in making longer-term decisions. We are pleased that the Minister has ensured that policies which provide multiple benefits for our natural environment through land use will be reflected in the final programme as well. And the committee was concerned to hear that 18% of our coastline is highly susceptible to erosion, and coupled with the continuing rise in sea levels, it's clear that our coastal communities are facing significant risk. Regarding their protection, we need to hear if the Minister is able to say if the recent events have highlighted the need to accelerate this work, and his statement last week is a help for us to know that many people share our concerns about this in this chamber. The committee heard of the new flood warning scheme being operated by SEPA. Is the Minister able to tell us how effective it's been over the last few weeks? In its letter to the Minister, the committee sought an update on how the Scottish Government will prioritise investment in flood risk management. The Minister confirmed in his response that this process would take place over the course of 2014, and an update would be available towards the end of this year. Is the Minister able to say if the Scottish Government is still working to the same timetable, or if the events of the last few weeks have shown that this work requires to be accelerated? Many of my colleagues may wish to come in on some of these flooding issues in due course. We are pleased that the Minister believes that more targeted support may be required for those in society who are the most vulnerable, because equalities issues must be considered in the whole matter of climate change. And it's often the most vulnerable, not just in the very, very shallow the islands in the Pacific, but right here in the heart of our own cities, where people can be very vulnerable indeed. And I think we've got to provide guidance to help them. Could the Minister tell us more of how this will be taken forward, because we consider that social justice as part of climate change? Presiding Officer, I hope that today's debate also helps to inform the final programme, and I'm happy, as I said, to move this motion in my name.
Many thanks, and can I remind members who wish to speak in the debate that they should press the request to speak buttons. I call on Paul Wheelhouse. Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think today I would like to thank the Rural Affairs Committee, Climate Change and Environment Committee for their efforts in scrutinising the draft Scottish Climate-Change-Adaptation programme. I welcome this debate and the opportunity to discuss how we can respond collectively to the threats and opportunities Scotland is facing from a changing climate and increased unpredictable weather. The latest evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sends a stronger warning than ever that human activity is changing the global climate. And the events of the past few weeks are a stark reminder of the importance of action, both in preparing for increasingly unpredictable weather and in moving towards low-carbon living. And Rob Gibson is absolutely right to pick up on these issues. In November, I attended the UN Climate Summit in Warsaw, which took place against the background of the devastating Philippines typhoon. At Warsaw, the international community agreed what is now a very tight timetable towards a new climate treaty to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, to be signed in Paris in December 2015. Despite the global commitment, though, to reduce emissions, climate change is already presenting challenges for Scotland's distinctive biodiversity and habitats, our built environment and infrastructure, and remote or indeed coastal communities, as Rob Gibson identified. And the inertia of the climate system means that some degree of further climate change is inevitable over the coming decades. The UK's first climate change risk assessment, published in 2012, shows the risks and opportunities to Scotland from a changing climate. We must prepare for these changes to minimise the impact and take advantage of the opportunities, although opportunities, I suspect, in some cases will be smaller than the impact of the negative impact of climate change. Our Scottish Climate Change Adaptation programme provides the framework that will build Scotland's resilience to the changing climate. I am aware that the committee heard evidence from stakeholders representing a wide range of interests. To name but a few: Scottish Fire and Rescue, Transport Scotland, SEPA, NFU Scotland, SE Link, Scottish Natural Heritage, Sustainable Scotland Network and Scotch Whisky Association. This emphasises the wide-ranging nature of the challenge, which presents both threats and opportunities for Scotland's economy, environment and people. And that is why we are committed to consulting on our first statutory Scottish Climate Change Adaptation programme. No one organisation can address this in isolation. There are complex interactions between and within sectors. Success will depend on organisations, businesses and communities across Scotland accepting responsibility and working in partnership. And if we are to create a Scotland which is increasingly recognised as an attractive, environmentally conscious and climate-resilient place in which to live, work and invest. In doing so, we will be helping to create a more successful country for all and supporting the foundations for long-term economic prosperity. Our adaptation programme provides a framework for everyone in Scotland to contribute towards the delivery of the objectives within their own organisation, business or community. The programme reflects the cross-cutting nature of the climate change challenge in the Scottish Government. It draws on action across ministerial portfolios, and my ministerial colleagues were involved in its preparation. I meet regularly with my ministerial colleagues to discuss climate change, and this engagement will continue. A number of issues were raised by the committee and respondents to the consultation, not all of which can be covered in the context of this short debate. I provided a written response to the issues raised by the committee, and the analysis of the consultation responses was published on the Scottish Government website on the 10th of January. I would like to take this opportunity now to respond to some of the issues raised by the convener in his opening statement. And I also intend on picking up some of the issues raised by the committee in my closing statement later on. In particular, in my closing statement, I will clarify the monitoring and reporting arrangements for the programme, as well as key issues around flooding, ecosystems and our natural environment. And I would welcome members' views on these issues during the debate itself. The recent festive period has been an illustration of the pressures that severe weather can create. We considered these events in the Chamber on a number of occasions last week, and in general terms, they are examples of the adaptation programme in practice, dealing with issues such as flooding, disruption to transport and energy networks. The Parliament recognised the excellent work of responders. They were informed and prepared as to potential flood risk through the excellent SEPA and Met Office Scottish Flood Forecasting Service. With the help of these systems, they were able to work together effectively to reduce and manage the impacts of the flooding on the communities affected. In addition, through Floodline Direct Warning Service, the public were directly warned and informed. I have asked SEPA to consider what more could potentially be done to bring forward their published flood warning strategy. Tomorrow, at a pre-planned flooding summit with local authorities, I will help launch SEPA's new flood risk and hazard maps. These are an essential tool in supporting the development of flood risk strategies across Scotland. Actions that will help target efforts to plan and invest in reducing potential impacts in vulnerable areas. And this is a long-term programme of work, and collectively taking an innovative, joined-up, multi-agency and strategic response to the longer-term challenges which climate change provides. In addition, the Resilience Advisory Board Scotland for the Voluntary Sector Group, which is the national forum which brings together Scotland's statutory and voluntary emergency responder organisations to discuss cross-sector working, will meet on the 22nd of January. Members will discuss lessons learned from the experience of activations in response to recent weather events. The important role of the preparations made by individuals and communities is recognised, and the Scottish Government has published guidance for communities on community emergency planning on the Ready Scotland website. An example of community emergency planning in action during the recent period of severe weather was the great work done by members of Eyemouth Resilient Communities Group in the Scottish Borders. I'm sure Claudia Beamish is also familiar with their work. When the community was threatened by flooding in December, this group took part in a multi-agency meeting with statutory emergency responders and subsequently played an active role in partnership with Scottish Borders Council, checking on residents in the harbour area of the town. And through our adaptation programme, we will continue to develop and promote resources which support capacity building like this in communities. And through our support for Adaptation Scotland, we will continue to ensure wider engagement with communities in meeting the objectives in the programme. And the convener picked up the issue of social justice. Through the adaptation programme, we will continue to support measures to understand the effects of climate change on people, homes and communities, and to build the resilience of communities against climate change impacts, in particular impacts on vulnerable people. We will reflect progress in our annual reports to Parliament and future adaptation programmes. Wider engagement will be key to delivering our adaptation objectives, and local authorities and other public bodies, businesses, voluntary organisations and communities will be central in helping Scotland to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. Our support for Adaptation Scotland is a key mechanism through which we are building partnerships and support to deliver our objectives. We are also forging partnerships across the public sector. I am chairing a forum which includes leaders from across the public sector and the third sector. Councillor Stephen Hagan is Vice-Chair of this Public Sector Climate Leaders Forum, as well as representing the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. And working together, the Forum aims to provide strong and visible leadership across the public sector and beyond, and ensure that climate change action is driven more consistently across the sector as a whole. And we are building partnerships to improve our understanding of the impacts of climate change. Climate Exchange exemplifies the partnership approach. It builds on the strength of each of its partners, ensuring that our response to climate change is based on the best possible scientific evidence.
Minister, could you draw to a close, please?
I will do, Presiding Officer. I'll address the other points in my closing speech, but Scotland, to suffice to say, Scotland is well placed to respond to climate change through its rich natural resources. We are already achieving a great deal, and I hope to pick up the additional points in the closing speech, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Claudia Beamish. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This committee debate is extremely important and timely, both in the immediate aftermath of the recent severe weather and flooding, which has focused all our minds on emergency arrangements and resilience, but equally importantly, on the longer-term climate change adaptation process. The overarching aim, as I emphasise, is, I quote from the draft programme, to increase the resilience of Scotland's people, environment and economy to the impacts of a changing climate. Scottish Labour is solidly behind the committee motion, and I thank our convener and the Minister for the initial remarks in what I hope will be a positive debate. Our committee took a wide range of evidence, as has already been said, which was very broad and deep in its range. We wrote to the Minister and have received a detailed response, which has been helpful. There's also been Scottish Government consultation, public consultation, the result of which was out very recently. All this scrutiny, I believe, has helped to hone the draft programme into a more focused way forward. We're now at the stage where we have the opportunity to engage with each other and the Minister today and to take into account everything in the final programme. In his ministerial forward to the draft programme, the Minister states, our climate affects people's health, our road and rail services, water supplies, energy demands, tourism. The list is endless. It is indeed endless. And I'm very relieved to hear that the Minister has reassured us today about speaking with different departments, and that is an ongoing dialogue, so essential for tackling climate change. It's impossible for any single speaker to touch on all the issues, but between us we have a chance of getting it right. We should acknowledge that, importantly, the programme sets out, I quote, arrangements for wider engagement in meeting these objectives. As the Minister has just said, it is a collective endeavour. Governance arrangements are right at the heart of the way forward. In this rapidly changing world, it is essential that the Climate Change Delivery Board is a robust and effective body as it oversees delivery. In the draft programme, we hear that the board will have a new reporting role for the programme. It relates to the meeting of annual emissions targets, which we all know have been missed for successive years, and we have future challenges in this. I now want to turn to monitoring and assessment of the programme. In the Minister's response to the letter to our committee, he stated that it is important for the evaluation of the programme to be an ongoing process to ensure that the right measures are in place to address the effects of climate change. Having further stated that we are, and I quote, currently considering points for monitoring and reporting, and the views of committee and stakeholders will be taken into account, I note that the Minister will, in his closing remark, be explaining perhaps more about how this will work in practice, which would be helpful at this stage. Scottish Environment Link recommends in its briefing for the committee that all wider policies which will make Scotland resilient and adaptable to a changing climate in the long term should be addressed not just in terms of addressing risks in the next 5 years, but also beyond, and I hope the Minister will take this into account as well. In this context, the National Performance Framework 3 also has a fundamental role to play through the previous administration and beyond this one into the future, and I hope the Minister will agree with me on this. We state in our letter to the Minister, the committee will also consider climate change issues as part of its own scrutiny of NPF 3. That is still the performance framework, although we are going to be considering climate change issues in relation to the other acronym for the planning framework as well. The responses to the Scottish Government consultation show the range and depth of understanding and commitment to climate adaptation across Scotland. While there was, I quote, broad support for the programme's overarching framework and its objectives, policies and proposals, it was common to respondents to request more detail about certain aspects of the programme and to suggest that there could be a greater emphasis on taking action. I do think this is important in the final draft. And significantly, I quote again, there were requests for clarification about how the programme would be delivered, who was responsible, accountable for delivery, the priorities and timescales, funding and arrangements for reporting and monitoring. Now, a lot of this is there in the draft programme in the view of the committee, but there are ways perhaps that this could be sharpened. This chimes with some of our committee recommendations, and I ask the Minister to take these fundamental governance issues forward in the final adaptation programme. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I call on Alex Ferguson. Up to 5 minutes, please, Mr Ferguson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm not a great fan of the phrase adopting a holistic approach, but one thing is for sure, if climate change adaptation is to be successfully mainstreamed, not just across government departments, but also across organisations, businesses, the public sector, communities and individuals, then a holistic approach is exactly what will have to be adopted. Over the last year, each and every one of us has experienced the stark impact of our changing climate, be it through the damaging snows of last spring, the delights of a searingly hot summer, or the sodden aftermath of the excessive rainfall of the last few weeks. If ever there was a year that highlighted the fact that climate change impacts on all of us, individually and collectively, then surely 2013 was it. So we very much welcome the Government's preparation of a climate change adaptation programme and the recognition by the Government that a much wider approach is necessary if it's to be successful. To that end, it's difficult not to sympathise with those stakeholders that drew the committee's attention to their disappointment that the programme looks only at a 5-year timescale when most believe that a much longer-term approach is necessary. Now, I fully understand, and I do sympathise, that this is not an easy thing to achieve, but I wholeheartedly endorse the committee's recommendation that the final programme takes a longer-term view and, where possible, assists stakeholders to develop longer-term approaches. I also endorse the committee's recommendation, as agreed by stakeholders, that the final programme should include a stronger focus on targets and set out a robust monitoring and evaluation system, something that has already been referred to several times. Such a system is crucially important if this programme is to be successful. And again, I do understand the difficulties of setting targets in this area of policy, but without them, I would suggest that evaluation and effective monitoring will be all but impossible. And I think we'd all agree that effective monitoring and evaluation are actually essential if this programme is to have a meaningful outcome. And I look forward very much to what the Minister is going to say about that in his closing comments. Presiding Officer, I was very pleased that the committee heard specifically from the Fire and Rescue Service on how it is already adapting to climate change. And I have to say that this was evidenced vividly over New Year in my own constituency, where there was extensive flooding in the river valleys and an intensive battering of the coastal defences from the sea, all of which required the emergency services to step up to the mark, and they were certainly not found wanting in that regard. And I think it's also right that the importance of partnership working with local voluntary services, often individuals, is duly recognised. Farmers, for example, are increasingly playing a major part in post-snowstorm relief activities, and these partnerships are to be greatly welcomed and encouraged. As the committee heard, extreme weather is everyone's problem, and a collective approach is required if, as we all suspect, today's challenges are to continue, possibly to an even greater degree into the future. So I, for one, would like to see the final programme be somewhat more explicit on the support that will be available to help develop partnerships between emergency and voluntary services. Presiding Officer, time does not allow me to cover every aspect of the committee's response to this consultation, so I'll conclude with a brief comment on the impact of climate change on agriculture and forestry. As Rob Gibson mentioned in his opening comments, the committee heard that farmers, who I think are amongst the most adaptable individuals on earth, are actually struggling to keep pace in adapting to climate change. That in itself should be a pretty stark warning to all of us. But the fact is that agriculture has a major and a positive role to play in tackling climate change, but it will need support, both financial and practical, if it is to carry out that role effectively. Similarly, we're all aware of the role forestry has to play in combating climate change. And while I very much welcome the research that is underway in relation to agroforestry, the fact is that the government's target of planting 100,000 hectares of new forestry by 2020 is looking to be increasingly in question. And while this is not a recommendation of the committee, I would recommend, if it doesn't sound too high-handed, that the Minister takes a long, hard look at the government's forestry policy to ensure that this sector does play its full part in combating climate change while maintaining the critical mass of commercial timber production that the milling industry needs if it is to continue investing in this sector. Presiding Officer, I very much welcome this debate. I look forward to hearing further contributions and will comment, if I may, on the Government's response when winding up. Thank you.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate. Up to 4-minute speeches, as we're very tight for time. Angus MacDonald to be followed by Sarah Boyd, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say at the outset how pleased I am to contribute to the debate, an important issue that requires the attention of all parliamentarians and all committees within this Parliament, not just the Iraqi Committee. And I'm pleased to hear the Minister confirm today that he meets regularly with other ministers to specifically discuss climate change. We've seen it first-hand in all our constituencies, the evidence that Scotland's climate is changing. Just last month, for example, we saw the wettest December for Scotland since records began in 1910, and the average winter precipitation in the 1990s and 2000s was around 23% higher than the 1961 to 1990 baseline, compared to the 1960s, which was around 9% lower. As we've already heard, the main aim of the Climate Change Adaptation Programme is to increase the resilience of Scotland's people, environment and economy to the impacts of the changing climate. And as the Scottish Government is leading by example, then it's also incumbent upon this Parliament and us as parliamentarians, as well as local authorities, to lead by example and give this enormously important issue the attention it deserves. It's clear that preparing for unavoidable climate change and reducing emissions are both essential actions if we are to ensure economic growth in Scotland and protect our much-valued natural environment, and we must use every opportunity we can to get the message over that climate is changing and that key challenges lie ahead for our people, communities and the most vulnerable in society. And while the long-term framework for building Scotland's resilience to climate change has been led by the Scottish Government, it's imperative that partnership working is encouraged and facilitated through forming new partnerships and collaborations. Now, there are good examples of this happening, and I'm looking forward to seeing at first hand the work of Climate Exchange, Scotland's Centre of Expertise on Climate Exchange here in Edinburgh, which is a partnership that shares ideas of good practice across areas of common interest to help increase the resilience of Scotland's people, environment and communities, when our committee visits in just over a week's time. And we also have the opportunity to see at first hand the new Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation building. Other good examples of best practice are how flexible adaptation has been built into long-term investment decisions. For example, the 2014 Commonwealth Games Village has built in green-blue networks and SUDs, and the 2020 Group is creating alliances across the public and private sectors by sharing knowledge and developing business awareness in tackling risk. I was therefore pleased to see the Minister's response to the committee's concerns regarding the potential vulnerabilities of small and medium-sized businesses, in which he pledged to continue to provide targeted support to SMEs, ensuring that businesses have a good understanding of the range of risks they may face from the impacts of climate change. However, it's worth reiterating that the committee heard concerns from stakeholders about the potential vulnerability of SMEs to climate change and extreme weather events, and while the work of the 2020 Group is positive and welcomed, stakeholders were of the view that more attention needs to be given to smaller businesses. However, as the convener has mentioned already, we welcomed the Minister's positive response to that issue. Our committee report also raised the issue of climate justice and social justice and called on the Scottish Government to ensure that social justice aspects of the adaptation programme are given more weight to the final programme. The poor and the vulnerable are the first to be affected by climate change and will suffer the worst through no fault of their own, as they have done little or nothing to cause a problem in the first place. The committee therefore welcomed the commitment from the Minister to take a lead on ensuring the vulnerability of communities and the social justice dimension of climate change impacts are addressed, and we look forward to further responses to that. Before I close, Presiding Officer, if I could just touch on the need for more effective monitoring and assessment. In particular, the committee wished to stress that the final programme should include a stronger focus on targets and set out a robust monitoring and evaluation framework, as alluded to by Alex Ferguson. In closing, Presiding Officer, it is clear that climate change adaptation has to be tackled in an incremental way with strong partnership working, knowledge transfer and developing methods to support adaptation by communities themselves. Not all impacts require immediate responses. However, I am sure if we all work together, we are going to get there. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Sarah Boyd, to be followed by Nigel Dawn. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the committee and witnesses for their work in getting us to this debate today. I want to focus on the processes and principles of adaptation in relation to planning decisions and the importance of flooding as a key test of the adaptation programme. Because, as others have said, we can be in no doubt that our planning system should be able to ensure decisions that avoid increasing the risk of flooding. And it's important in both human and economic terms. The report highlights that climate change will increase the incidence of flooding and the risk that entails of injury, the impact on people's mental health and even death, and if nothing else, that should prompt us to act. Over the years, colleagues across the Chamber have related the catastrophic impact of flooding on their constituencies. And this strategy is an opportunity both to learn from past problems and set out the solutions that are needed. I believe the review of Scottish planning policy and NPF3 provide us with the opportunity to incorporate flood management techniques routinely in every single planning decision to contribute to the Scottish Government's adaptation strategy. But adaptation measures in relation to flooding need greater priority and urgency from where we are now. Sustainable urban drainage systems are now more than a decade old, so I'd be keen to hear from the Minister what is being done to evaluate the impact of early schemes and to measure whether the principles are being consistently applied in development proposals. What work is being done to work with developers to increase their knowledge and share best practice, and also to inform householders of their responsibilities and the practical measures that they can take. SEPA's analysis highlights the geographical areas which are vulnerable to flooding, and the role of local authorities in planning investment is crucial because they are partners in the research that the Scottish Government carries out on best practice, but they also need support to build capacity in areas like project management of major flood prevention works. And it's the same issue in terms of transport and development projects generally. We need that capacity. Then there's the issue of their capacity to implement the sustainable flood management duties that are in the Water Environment Water Services Act. Again, I'd be keen to hear what research the Scottish Government has carried out since the implementation of the Act. One of my first acts as a relatively new MSP and Minister for the Environment was to deal with constituents and businesses about the impact of flooding in my constituency in the year 2000. Even then, people were concerned not just about the immediate support they needed, but to look at the longer-term planning for flood investment. And the delays associated with planning and construction of flood management would be an excellent case study for students, professionals and indeed ourselves to look at what can go wrong even with the best of intentions. While it's no consolation for my constituents, Phase 1 has been completed, although that was delayed for the best part of a decade and costs escalated, but we're stuck not being able to get Phase 2 going yet, and Phase 3 is not even on the drawing table. So I'm really glad I've got the opportunity to talk to the Minister about this, to look at the financial gap, because the delays that we have in practical terms, when we have solutions that are ready, we've just got to work our way beyond that because it's not acceptable in terms of flood risk management. I started talking about the human dimension that the adaptation report highlights. Before Christmas, I met with community council members locally who were exasperated that we hadn't got them, and I mean this politicians across the spectrum. They were exasperated that we collectively had not fixed this problem for them. And when I returned from Christmas, I got incredibly moving correspondence about constituents who relayed to me their anxiety because of heavy rainfall. That happens every time we have heavy rainfall. I'm sure I'm not alone. This is not a theoretical problem. It matters to our constituents, our businesses and our habitats. While we can't control everything and we can't fix everything, we have to push climate change adaptation up the political agenda to make sure we get the right research, the right lessons learned, the right skills and experience, and the crucial investment to make it happen. That's why this debate is vital. That's why the final climate adaptation strategy needs to be better, to be a better reflection of the role of local authorities in that agenda. It needs clearer targets, a greater sense of urgency, and it needs greater political commitment from the Scottish Government. And hopefully that's what this debate will deliver. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Nigel Dawn to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I hardly do need to point out in the early part of 2014 that climate change is with us. And I also think we've quickly reached the point where it doesn't actually matter why it's happening. Your view of global warming is now irrelevant. The difficulty we now have, of course, is thinking ahead. And I think the challenge, if we are going to tell our society that they must think ahead, is to make sure that we do it ourselves. And actually, we must be very careful to ensure that we do think as far ahead as we possibly can. That doesn't necessarily mean we have a written down plan that goes as far as some people would like, but we must recognise that whatever we're doing now must be developed as it goes along and must be longer sighted as we go along, because it is a long-term problem. I'm absolutely delighted, if I heard the Minister right, to pick up these flood risk maps are coming out tomorrow. Was that right? Yes, long overdue. You can't do things with land without maps, and I'm absolutely delighted, therefore, to hear that we've got that far. Now, can I take issue with at least what's been said, even if not what's been meant, about targets and measurement? Because it does seem to me we do need to distinguish these. And if you'll forgive me, Presiding Officer, I'm going to go for a journey, as most of us will. In practice, getting around our constituencies, we have to drive a car. There is no alternative in practice for most of us. And if you have a relatively modern car, and I've never had a very modern car, it has up the front, just in front of you, a miles per gallon, which is the currents, which doesn't really tell you very much other than the very obvious, but then the average for the trip. Now, if that is anything like accurate and reproducible, That is an extraordinarily useful number, and I'll put my factory engineer's hat on and tell you once more that what gets measured gets done. You have in front of you a number which is telling you, on average, the fuel efficiency of your driving. Remarkably, it's still in miles per gallon, which I don't think are metric units, but never mind. Now, I could set down a target if I know what best practice is for that journey. But no target is of any use at all if it isn't relevant to what I'm currently trying to do. And if I'm doing something for the very first time, a target is totally meaningless. But the measurement is crucial, because every single one of us will instinctively look at that miles per gallon and say, what can I do to get the miles per gallon to be bigger from wherever I am starting? So I think we need to be careful not to come up with arbitrary targets which are not helpful, and make sure that what we measure and reproduce is accurate, and then targets will set themselves. Very quickly, Presiding Officer, because I'm conscious of time, we had a presentation at the Cross-Party Group on Construction last year from Retrofit Scotland. This is an organisation, an ad hoc organisation of professionals who are trying to put together case studies and examples of how we in Scotland should adapt our buildings for the future, with climate change very much in mind, because we have to get fuel efficiency up for all the reasons we now understand. What I can say to you, Minister, is that that group would very much like and welcome some government support and interest. It is a group that has come together, as I say, very professionally, entirely off their own bat and their own expense, and it would be very much appreciated if the government could interact with that. Lastly, can I pick on the subject of flooding, because I just have to? Can I thank the Minister for signing off the scheme in Brechin, in my home city? As I understand it, we're now in a position where COSLA has to come up to the money and with the money, and we'll twist as many arms as we possibly can. Can I also thank Aberdeenshire Council for coming up with a scheme in Stonehaven, which I know the Minister is supportive of, and can I encourage him to proceed with that as fast as is conceivably possible for the good of my constituents. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now calling Jim Hume, to be followed by Jimmy Hepburn.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I, like many others, were proud to put through this Parliament the Climate Change Scotland Act back in 2009. Although there were differences at the time regarding how quickly Scotland should have to act, we did all come up with a world-leading piece of legislation. Part of that act was a responsibility to ensure we are prepared, as we can be, for climate change effects, basically a risk assessment. I don't think there are many out there who don't think that there is a change in the world's climate. Again, in Scotland, we've seen some amazing wind speeds recently, coupled in some parts with flooding, all seemingly related to the extremes in temperature across the pond in America, where Arctic air has plunged parts of the USA into a deep freeze, and even the iconic Niagara Falls froze. Regarding the consultation on Scotland's adaptation programme, to me what it did highlight was that we as a Parliament, and of course this relates to government, are aware of the work that is being done to make our future better prepared, and that is also the case with many public bodies. That's borne out in the respondents that did reply. Over half were actual public bodies who have defined duties in the Act, and out of the 67 responses, only 3 were from organisations, not from organisations, I should say, from individuals, and only 4 came from the private sector organisations. And that's only 67 responses from around 600 individuals and organisations who were actually invited to respond. So that is quite disappointing. That, to me, highlights the duty that befalls on us all to make climate change more relevant. We cannot deliver climate change targets and adapt to the changes that are happening without buy-in from everyone. My view is echoed by some in the consultation who thought that the government needs to address arrangements for better public engagement. And in answer to question 5B, 58% of respondents ticked no when asked if they thought that arrangements for public engagement are sufficient. Having been a land user myself, I also focused on who actually engaged with the consultation, and bearing in mind that land users are vital to help deliver mitigation and adaptation to climate change, it was quite alarming to see that NFUS, Scottish Land and Estates Tenant Farmers, Confor and the like hadn't submitted a response, although some have, of course, had given evidence to our committee. That's not a criticism of those organisations. They all have quite limited resources. It's a criticism of us all being able to make climate change relevant to those who can help most. So I'd be interested in hearing the Minister's view on how this can be better addressed. In the limited time that I do have, I note that respondents emphasise the importance of capacity building. To me, that further highlights the need for much better engagement with public and private sector. And I further note that respondents noted there was a heavy emphasis on flooding, which of course is a very visual and damaging effect from climate change. But an adapted Scotland will need community partnerships like the Eyemouth example that the Minister mentioned. Of course, for emergency responses, care for the vulnerable is needed, and the use of existing, perhaps private equipment when there are perhaps snowstorms or damage from winds. There will have to be organisation in place prior to any event. And a good example of that is Scottish Borders Council and RAINET volunteers from the amateur radio enthusiasts world who have now got a memorandum of understanding, and they've been they and their likes have been responsible for helping in the Lockerbie disaster, Indian Ocean tsunami, and of course over in Hurricane Katrina. Anyway, Presiding Officer, I welcome the progress of the draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme and this consultation. I think all of those who found the time to respond. There's much consultation responses that and the RACCE committee will further examine, and I look forward to the Minister addressing my points today.
Many thanks. Now call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Cara Hilton. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and in welcoming the debate, can I thank the committee for bringing it forward and also the work they've done in assessing the draft Climate Change Adaptation programme. And I think I picked the convener up rightly in hearing him say that will be ongoing work, so I very much welcome that. In this Parliament, Presiding Officer, we often hear members talk about the pride they have in the legislation we've passed to try and see action to tackle climate change. And it's clear why we need such legislation. Over the last few decades in our country, it's become warmer, wetter, with an increase in the amount of rainfall, especially in winter, and the occurrence of heavy downpours. And we've seen that very much the case in recent weeks. A vivid demonstration of climate change, and human activity obviously contributes to that. So it's clear we have to respond to that challenge. So we can be proud of our legislation, but only if it's going to be effective insofar as it leads to any positive change. Indeed, the Scottish Environment Link, who provided a briefing, who have welcomed the draft programme, made the point that Scotland needs to plan now for the consequences and impacts of our changing climate. Scotland must reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also adapt how we run our economy, our society, and how we look after our environment. But it is clear that the legislation we have passed, with the targets we have to achieve, is to some extent working. We are on track to meet the 2020 target. Scotland's adjusted emissions have fallen by 25.7% from 1990, so we are on target to meet that ambitious target. So any climate change adaptation programme has to complement and build on other efforts and make a positive contribution. In that regard, of course, the programme is itself a requirement within the Climate Change Scotland Act. So I'm confident that the programme will meet the test of complementing wider efforts to tackle climate change. I want to speak briefly in the short time available about just a couple of areas in the draft programme, focusing on some of the areas the committee picked up. But before I say it, can I say I'm very positive about the programme. Jim Hume was a little critical about the consultation, but I actually welcome the wide consultation there's been. It's clear there's been efforts to engage with the public, private and third sectors working across a range of different areas in terms of planning, energy, transport and others, and that seems to me to be a pretty diverse group of respondents. In terms of a couple of areas I wanted to focus on, the first being the efforts to build resilience in responding to emergency situations, which I think is topical given the problems we've seen recently. I noted the committee considers local partnerships are vitally important in helping build the resilience of local communities, and I know that the government responded to that, setting out some of the work that's done in terms of guidance and building community resilience. supporting a number of mechanisms which enable groups to share good practice, and the Ready Scotland website, which the Minister mentions. Clear work is going on to build community resilience, and I wonder if the Minister could set out how these tools are utilised in practice in responding to emergency situations when he closes. The other area I wanted to focus on was this idea of embedding across government departments and in wider society the wider approach to tackling climate change. And the Minister spoke about dialogue with his colleagues, and I know that the committee made a recommendation trying to get this wider direction. Again, I wonder if the Minister could set out how, providing an update, it's obviously very important we get that wider buy-in. Maybe he can set out how the government is working to that end. Those were just a couple of the areas I wanted to raise, but I want to close by re-emphasising I'm very positive about the adaptation programme, and I look forward to this chamber returning to this subject matter in future, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now calling Cara Hilton, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've got robust evidence for global warming, as colleagues have already talked about, but there's still many unknowns and variables involved in predicting exactly how our climate will change as a result. It's always tempting to hope for the best when developing policy, but this must be coupled with planning and preparation for all possible climate change scenarios. From dealing with long-term changes to agriculture and energy, to building sustainability into our economy, to coping with the changing nature and frequency of extreme weather events that colleagues have mentioned, our policies for climate change adaptation must be capable of addressing all the challenges that we face. For example, assumptions about sea level rises may need to be reassessed following work by Glasgow University, which was conducted recently. It was previously thought that much of Scotland's land was rising faster than the sea around it. Recent studies suggest that this effect is now fading, and it means that our coastal communities will be more exposed to the consequences of climate change than what we thought before. The most attractive adaptations are often those that deliver other benefits for households and businesses, mainly financial, to be fair. But while these have got long-term value, even without climate change, sometimes the benefits can take many years to outstrip costs, and this can be a big barrier to adoption. The Scottish Government and public bodies need to do a lot more to encourage and facilitate such changes. And as a result of Labour amendments to the Climate-Change Scotland Act, they've got a public duty to do that and more. One route for promoting better adaptation is through procurement. Public bodies should be doing a lot more to include climate change considerations in their procurement policies, ensuring that the climate change consequences of public sector contracts are fully assessed, not just in respect of the public body's own activities, but also the activities of their contractors. There are also great ways of combining adaptation with health initiatives. Food sourced directly from local production is not only fresher, it travels fewer miles, and it's good news for emissions reductions too. Now in its 7th year, the Fife Diet project is an excellent example of the important role that local food systems can play. Fife Diet have adopted a collaborative approach to the development of community food in terms of its potential for improving health, affordability and sustainability. It's a fantastic project that's making a real difference, and we need more projects like this across Scotland. Big business also needs to buy in to a far greater extent to localised distribution. How often does locally produced food travel hundreds of miles in a round trip before it finds its way back to our local stores? And it's also vital that the private sector role is developed alongside the public and third sector. And as Angus MacDonald said, as small and medium-sized enterprises got a crucial role to play here. They're often locally based, they serve local markets, and there's a lot more that they could be doing to reduce carbon footprints and contribute to climate change adaptation. But the reality is they lack the resources, and we need to ensure that they have both the knowledge and the incentives to incorporate climate change action into their activities. The Climate-Change Scotland Act was passed with great fanfare, and rightly so. It was globally groundbreaking legislation. But unfortunately, we've struggled to match its ambition with action. And I think it's especially disappointing that in Scotland we've failed to meet our emissions targets in each of the last 2 years. And I would welcome the Minister's comments on how we're going to address that. The document we're discussing contains lots of worthwhile proposals, but as ever, good intentions aren't sufficient. It's absolutely essential that Scotland has an effective adaptation programme. We have got a moral responsibility to take every action possible to mitigate the effect of climate change in Scotland and across the world. We've got a duty to our children, to their children and their children's children. Climate change is the most important and most challenging issue we will ever face, and the bottom line is we not only promise radical action, we also commit the time, money and resources to achieve it. So the Minister's letter responding to the committee's points was encouraging, and I hope therefore that the Scottish Government will strongly consider the committee's recommendations on how the draft programme can be strengthened and include our recommendations in the final programme.
Many thanks. Now call on Patrick Harvey, after which move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's probably fair to say that climate change adaptation often plays second fiddle a wee bit to the mitigation agenda, to the urgent need to reduce our emissions. That's true in relation to public perception, media coverage, political debate, institutional knowledge, and I think, to be fair, it's even true in relation to the environment movement as well, and the issues that people campaign on. The opportunity, though, that arises, although people in this debate, I'm sure, all understand the difference between climate and weather, when we see, either first-hand or on our television screens, the impact of extreme weather events, flooding, wind and rain, drought or heat wave, when we see those images or when we experience those things in our lives, it's an opportunity to consider both sides of the coin, adaptation and mitigation. And there is some overlap between them in issues of land use. Changing land use patterns are raised by both agendas, infrastructure and the questions of a just transition, particularly, for example, as the Minister mentioned, for Scotland, where a great deal of our economy is reliant on issues to do with land use, whether that's agriculture for domestic consumption or for export, tourism and so on. There are some other points that have been made that I could echo. Sarah Boyack's argument around the need to consider flood management in every single planning decision that's been made. Alex Ferguson's argument that a longer-term approach needs to be taken to these issues rather than just a 5-year cycle. And I think that was echoed as well in the Scottish Environment Link briefing to members. The one area I wanted to focus on, though, is an area where I feel more work needs to be done. It wasn't until page 53 on the draft strategy that we started to hear a few short paragraphs on the impact climate change will have on the wider world and Scotland's need to adapt to that. Scotland adapting to climate change is not just about adapting to extreme weather impacts that climate change will bring in Scotland. It's about adapting to a wider world. These paragraphs say that the Scottish economy may be affected by the impacts of climate change overseas. These effects may be considerable and possibly larger than the immediate impacts of climate change in Scotland. It doesn't unpack this argument, this range of scenarios that we may encounter in any great detail, and I could see very little in the list of actions that relate to this. At a global scale, the report says the impact of climate change could lead to restrictions on food supply, leading to higher prices and lower availability in Scotland. These could exacerbate food-related health and social inequalities in Scotland. This is true, but it's only really the beginning of an attempt to engage with this argument. And I would encourage the government very strongly in continuing to develop this strategy as it moves from a draft into a final document. Really more work needs to be done on this. We're living in such a globalised world. There's nobody in this room who can't immediately lay their hands on products that arrived on these shores in a shipping container. Well, if the projections about sea level rise that we're seeing now do come true, every piece of port infrastructure in the world is at risk. Every piece of port infrastructure in this globalised world is at risk. What happens when that infrastructure starts to fail? What happens when crops in a globalised world? We've seen through the meat crisis recently just how complex and convoluted our food supply chains are. What happens when crops fail in developing countries? What happens when governments fail, when conflict arises over access to land and water? What happens when populations migrate? I would urge the Government, Deputy Presiding Officer, to give greater consideration, not just to the adaptation Scotland needs to make to changing weather patterns at home, but our adaptation to a changing global climate economically, as well as in climate change terms, in absolute terms.
Many thanks. Now move to closing speeches. Call on Alex Ferguson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has seen a fair amount of consensus across the Chamber, and that is very much as it should be in a debate of this nature. Climate change presents a very real challenge, possibly even a very real threat to us all, and while we might differ occasionally on the minutiae of how best to tackle it, the need for every sector of our society to adapt to meet that challenge is one on which we can all agree. So I welcome the consensus that's been shown this afternoon. I also think the debate has shown the value of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee's scrutiny of the government's draft programme. And there is no doubt that the sessions we had in committee with stakeholders have served to highlight a number of concerns about the programme while emphasising the compelling need for it. So we all can support the aim of increasing the resilience of Scotland's people, her environment and the economy to the impacts of a changing climate. And I think we all share the Minister's vision, as he stated in his response to the committee, in which he said, "My vision is that the overarching framework set out in the programme provides the basis for everyone in Scotland to contribute toward the delivery and of objectives within their own organisation, business or community." I could not possibly disagree with that vision, Presiding Officer. One aspect of the debate that has not had much of an airing this afternoon is the impact of climate change on the marine environment, which nowadays, of course, includes the aquaculture sector. That sector faces a number of challenges, some from invasive alien sources, but others such as sea lice, amoebic gill disease and algal blooms. But all of these are influenced by climate change, and I do acknowledge and welcome the fact that these issues will be kept under close consideration by the Ministerial Group on Sustainable Aquaculture, and I hope that the Minister will feel able to update Parliament on a regular basis as these issues are progressed. In terms of the sea fisheries, we've already seen the example of mackerel and herring stocks moving north effectively following their food sources, which has of course resulted in very real international problems with Iceland and the Faroes overfishing in frankly an unacceptable and irresponsible manner. So regulatory and trade agreements must be kept flexible in order to support our fishermen as they seek to cope with changes in the stocks of existing species or the potential movement of new species into our waters. And finally, Presiding Officer, I have to say it came as quite a shock to me when we were taking evidence in committee to learn, as I think has been mentioned earlier, that almost 20% of Scotland's coastline is highly susceptible to erosion. I have no doubt actually that much of it was further eroded on the 30th and 31st of December. But we do therefore welcome the fact that the government will make further assessment on the risks of coastal erosion so that some of our most vulnerable coastal communities can be properly protected. Some of them were very close to not being protected at all in the recent storms. And, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we live in precarious times as far as the impact of climate change is concerned. Nobody can doubt that. But I would suggest that government can only do so much. There is only so much that any government can do. And at the end of the day, it will fall to each and every one of us as individuals to ensure that any climate change adaptation programme is successful. I would contend that the government has made a good start in its draft. It will be up to all of us to help to deliver it. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks. Now call on Claudia Beamish. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In closing, I want to stress that there is a thread running through the adaptation programme, which is the value of interconnections and partnerships, showing the need for clear paths of communication. Making the programme mechanisms more clear will surely help to make this thread more strong. Multiple benefits are also a win-win. In the agriculture and forestry section of our letter, we state, the committee recommends that the Minister undertakes an evaluation of the extent to which the SRDP has delivered multiple benefits, for example, for biodiversity and climate change adaptation. Alex Ferguson stressed that evidence showed farmers were struggling to keep pace. In his letter to the committee, the Minister states that in relation to farming for a better climate and future-proofing of Scotland's farming, one of the key objectives of this is to raise awareness. And I would argue that it's important to raise awareness across all the sectors in relation to climate adaptation. The committee heard interesting evidence on agroforestry, and I'm pleased the Minister acknowledges this in his letter, and that will play a part in the future of SRDP. Both Rob Gibson and Alex Ferguson have highlighted marine issues, I'm very pleased to see, and the committee did welcome, I quote, clarification from the Minister that the assessment of the risk of coastal erosion in this area is being actively considered by the Scottish Government. It would be helpful to hear more on this as soon as possible. and also much research into marine climate change issues is at its early stages, as has been emphasised in other times at our committee, and it is essential in relation to the rapidly developing aquaculture industry and sustainable fisheries that climate change research is well funded for Marine Scotland, working with other partners such as MASTS. Research funding is essential within and across all sectors, building on new partnerships, if we are to use science-based evidence as we go forward in tackling climate change adaptation. Angus MacDonald emphasised the necessity of leadership, and the Public Sector Leaders Forum, on which I serve for our committee, will be essential in this regard. But we are all leaders in the Scottish Parliament and in our communities. Sarah Boyk explored the importance of local government engagement and the implications of for the planning system. The consultation response analysis showed that local authorities, and I quote, thought that their role in the delivery of the programme was missing or understated. Will the Minister look at this again? Cara Hilton drew our attention to the necessity for businesses to adopt the programme and analysed food issues. We heard in committee evidence from Nourish about the need for shorter supply chains and regionally integrated food supply chains, and I asked the Minister to give his view today on how this might be taken forward on a Scotland-wide basis. Many of the recommendations highlight how essential localisation of resilience is. Communities are at the heart of the way forward, although Patrick Harvey's arguments about the further analysis of global changes is also essential and missing from the programme as it stands at the moment. Within robust structures, perhaps most important of all is the social justice dimension, highlighted by Rob Gibson earlier. Our committee took stark evidence of concerns about vulnerable islands and challenged urban communities and households on low incomes. Jim Hume raised the issue of relevance. How relevant can these issues be to people who are struggling from day to day? How will the Scottish Minister ensure that the Adaptation Scotland and the Climate Challenge Funds and other bodies engage with these communities who are most in need of support in terms of flooding emergencies and longer-term resilience? Our committee welcomes the Minister's statement in his letter that we are currently considering how we can better understand the equalities impacts of climate change impacts, but the committee keenly awaits information from the Minister on these equalities issues in his conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Minister Paul Wheathouse, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, can I just thank members for what has been a very much consensual debate. I agree with Alex Ferguson in that, and I do agree with him it's rightly so. It's a matter that cuts across party political boundaries, and I did promise to come on to issues of monitoring and reporting, so I should focus on that because I know I've got tighter time than I had originally forecast. So I'll start with that and maybe come on to some of the other issues. Certainly, in terms of monitoring and reporting, I appreciate the number of members that have mentioned this as being a significant issue, and the reporting requirements for the programme are set out in the 2009 Climate-Change Scotland Act. Our progress, I believe, will be reflected in annual reports to the Scottish Parliament. An independent assessment will also be provided to the Scottish Parliament within 2 years of the programme being published to give feedback on how we're doing in terms of achieving our objectives. And we're currently considering arrangements for the independent assessment and are talking to the Adaptation Subcommittee of the UK Committee on Climate Change in this regard. And I will provide further detail on this in due course. And apologies to members. I will take a brief intervention. If I may.
Very brief intervention. Thank you. I'm grateful to the Minister. I wonder if you could just give your views very quickly on whether he believes that targets have a role to play in the monitoring and evaluation process.
Paul Wheathouse.
I think I agree with that. I mean, Nigel Dawn made some very valid points on this as well. I think it is important to have a focus to drive effort, and I think the maxim about what's measured gets done, I think, is probably a fair one. And we do need to look at that. So we'll, where we can, build in measures that give us some spine to what we're trying to achieve. I think that's going to be helpful. I'll briefly try and pick up as many of the committee members' points as possible before I move to conclusions. Certainly, I take on board the points that Claudia Beamish made about the National Performance Framework and also the other MPF and National Planning Framework 3. I think those are important aspects. We need to look at the planning system and how it can help reinforce our intentions here in terms of trying to make Scotland as resilient a country as we can do. I think both Claudia Beamish and Alex Ferguson touch upon issues which particularly relate to the Farming for a Better Climate programme, which I've written to the committee about, but I think is extremely important. It's something the Cabinet Secretary also wants to see enhanced, if possible, in terms of our efforts in terms of farming for a better climate. And that will not only help with mitigation, but clearly be important in making our farming sector as resilient as possible to the kind of events that Alex Ferguson referred to. And I do think he is right to highlight it's not just about flooding, which is the current issue that's been of most focus to us, but also about heat and indeed, in some cases, very severe snow, as Mr Ferguson's constituents and my own and Claudia Beamish's constituents will know very well from this earlier this last year. In terms of the issue that Sarah Boyd raised in terms of SUDs, we do feel we have, in Scotland at least, we have a reasonably good track record on these issues, but we're not complacent, and I am planning to meet with key stakeholders to take forward how we can look at what more can be done in terms of sustainable drainage systems. And I do take that point on board. Patrick Harvey referred to the international dimension. I think he's absolutely right. This is not just about a domestic agenda. Much of our economy would be vulnerable to impacts on the food supply chain. And indeed, as consumers, we all have to take that on board as well. I would point out that the next the climate change risk assessment, which is going to be undertaken at a UK level, will focus more on the international dimension. That's something that would then feed through into Scottish Government's own planning. So we will get the evidence on that, and I've indeed had some interaction with the Met Office on some of the impacts that might be felt in our key international development partner countries like Malawi, to understand what impacts they face, and they are severe in the current trajectory we are heading on as a planet. In terms of Angus MacDonald made some important points about partnership working. I think he's absolutely right, and indeed the climate justice agenda at home as well as abroad. We do know that in terms of equalities, that it's often the communities that are in lower income groups which are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They are traditionally in lower quality housing, sometimes in the floodplain or in areas that are traditionally being built on in the floodplain, and therefore they are at risk. So we do have to take into account equalities issues and reaching conclusions as to what strategy we take, and to prioritise and target our help to help those who are least able to help themselves within Scotland. In terms of the points that were made, Jamie Hepburn asked about how we are using data in terms of our resilience programme, and certainly Ready Scotland, Traffic Scotland and indeed SEPA's floodline services are absolutely vital to informing the public, so that we were able to inform them of the actions they could take, both in terms of avoiding journeys where that was possible, taking alternative routes to get to work or to meet relatives, or indeed to prepare their property for the imminent risk of flooding. And these are absolutely crucial, and the more we will do as much as we can to make sure that the take-up of these services is enhanced. And I was delighted to see that if there was a silver lining in the cloud that came over the festive period, there's been an increased take-up of the floodline service. So we now have up to 18,200 people registered with the service, and that relates to perhaps up to 125,000 properties across Scotland that are known to be at risk from flooding. So we are getting there slowly but surely, and I encourage all members to make as many of their constituents aware of these services and get them to sign up to them where possible. Just in closing, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious of time, we know that Scotland has to become a more resilient society, and that's something that is a key priority for the Government. We are working very closely in partnership with local authorities, SEPA, Scottish Water, power companies, the emergency services, to make sure that we are doing all we can to target our efforts and reduce the risks to our society from a changing climate. Our adaptation programme will continue to support activities like SEPA's flood risk awareness raising activities, including floodline. Our natural environment is indeed itself vulnerable, so it's not just about people. Our natural environment is vulnerable to changes in climate, and we know that many species are threatened by climate change, and some impacts may be irreversible, but we will do what we can as a society to address them. And we estimate that Scotland's natural environment is worth up to £23 billion per year to the country. And this puts in perspective just the importance of protecting our environment from the impact of climate change. And we have a lot of work going on in land use. I think was raised by a number of people in terms of looking at regional land use framework pilots, and that's an area I hope to report back to Parliament on in due course. We have a solid evidence base for understanding the impacts on our society of climate change, and that evidence base will continue to develop. We are already working with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to develop a further climate change risk assessment, as I mentioned in relation to Mr Harvey's point. And we're working with Climate Exchange, mentioned by Angus MacDonald, and the Adaptation Subcommittee on the Committee on Climate Change to take forward our strategy. Presiding Officer, we obviously are aware that this is an issue that is going to become more and more significant for our country, and we are developing our adaptive capacity. And I would just like to thank organisations like Adaptation Scotland, who play an important part in shaping some of this work, and will continue to support our activity. The consultation responses and indeed the committee's work are very valuable to the Government, and we have taken on board many of the messages. We will be working on finalising our adaptation programme in the near future, and I look to show the committee and indeed members of the Chamber that we have listened to the points that have been raised and do what we can to ensure that we have a strategy that makes Scotland the most resilient country we can make it, and help us to adapt to the effects of climate change, help us to protect Scotland's much loved and natural environment, and of course make us a more resilient country to live and work in. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Now call on Graham Day to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee. Between 8 and 9 minutes, please, Mr Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Preparing for today's debate prompted me to reread in detail the evidence on the draft programme given during 2 stakeholder sessions held on October the 30th last year. I remember at the time leaving that sitting in the committee feeling quite invigorated by what I'd heard. Going over the official report ahead of this afternoon, I must say, had a similar effect. The evidence received was as constructive and detailed as it was wide-ranging, and on behalf of the members of the committee, I'd want to place on record our appreciation of the contribution made by witnesses and stakeholders to our deliberations, and concur with the Minister when, in his letter responding to the committee's report, he said the process had, and I quote, provided valuable insights and raised useful questions, end quote. There was across the panel's absolute unanimity on the fact that right across society the impacts of climate change are being felt. Professor Des Thompson of SNH told us we are now seeing in our seas and mountains and on the coast rapid changes such as have never been seen before in a similar time frame. Andrew Bauer of the NFUS told us that from a farming point of view the impacts are already here. The growing seasons have changed. Farmers are already adapting what they are growing because extreme weather events are making potentially higher profit crops more risky to plant. Jim Densham of RSPB Scotland revealed that across various RSPB sites, including some of Scotland's most special places, every day issues and impacts are being seen which cannot be disentangled from climate change. David Goodhue of the Scottish Fire and Rescue admitted that the past decade had seen a recognition that the impacts of climate change are more variable and wide-reaching than was originally anticipated. In response, he explained that the Fire and Rescue Service will now having to purchase more 4x4 vehicles with differential locks on rear axles and exhaust pipes above 18 inches to meet the challenging and range of circumstances they have to operate in. So it is widely recognised that we have significant problems to respond to, and whilst the DEFRA Secretary Owen Patterson has sought to portray the consequences of climate change as offering an opportunity for agriculture, Andrew Bauer revealed the sector in Scotland does not entirely share that viewpoint. He told us we can foresee the benefit, but the uncertainty could wipe that all out. You might be okay 1 year, in 5, but for the others, you could suffer significant problems. I am not betting my house on the benefits outweighing the negatives that we have to deal with. One specific downside he predicted was that going forward, we would see a decline in areas that are fit for production in some of our farming heartlands. So what is going on out there as we react to the impact of climate change? What are we as a society doing well? What do we need to do better? Let's deal specifically with the adaptation policy first. We were told the Government had made good strides in taking forward the existing framework and developing it. The move away from adopting a sectoral approach and towards an integrated package was welcomed, albeit there was a call for building on that. Jim Densham, though, rightly made the point, as Alex Ferguson and Patrick Harvey have, that we need to think beyond 5-year programmes of objectives, proposals and policies, which give us a short-term look at and control over what needs to happen, but don't consider the longer term. As Mr Densham said, we need to be clear in where we're going and how we will deliver a resilient, adaptable Scotland, something he felt doesn't quite come across in the draft. In essence, absolutely.
Thank the Deputy Convener for taking the intervention, and apologise for interrupting. Just to say that the Climate Change Scotland Act specified a 5-year time horizon. That's the predominant driver for our approach. However, we obviously will look to take on board the points that have been made by members at a longer term as well.
Thank the Minister for that. I think we are aware that it was 5-year programmes, but I think it was a general point about looking beyond that as well, as far as we could. As regards some of the areas where government, other public sector bodies, the utilities and the private sector are already responding, we heard from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service of how experience has taught them to work more closely with partner agencies in response to flooding predictions and forward deploy equipment and personnel. We were told that the amalgamation of the police and fire brigades and international forces had, and I quote, invigorated the process of ensuring assets are aligned to risks and the right resources are in the right place at the right time. We were advised that building upon the publication of the National Flood Risk Assessment recent. SEPA has moved on to the new flood risk and hazard maps, which are to be launched tomorrow, as the Minister revealed. And next year we'll see the development of risk management strategies, which will look at the biggest risks in each local authority. We heard also from Gordon McGregor of Scottish Power, who revealed the power companies are working on a daily basis to monitor weather and its impact on power assets, making those assets more resilient, particularly in areas where they are subject to frequent storms, and building stress testing into the process of designing future infrastructure. Amongst the areas highlighted that could be improved upon or required to be addressed were better joined-up working between agriculture and local authorities. So we might have farmers planting low-value crops in fields which could be utilised for floodplain storage rather than high-value crops which then have to be written off out of necessity for the greater good. It was suggested that in pursuing woodland expansion we should not see large-scale reversion from farming to forestry, that we should actively pursue pockets of forestry and agroforestry systems. We were told of upcoming problems in the likes of Angus and Fife with their short coastal rivers and areas of intensive agriculture with drought. Indeed, the committee was advised that in some parts of the country last year we came within a week of restrictions being placed upon irrigation. It was suggested that offline and winter storage and reservoirs needed to be encouraged. The committee heard also of the need to support the research community. Professor Thompson summed it up thus: rapid and risky things are now being thrown at our environment. Unless we have science and innovative techniques in place to try and combat them, we will simply be folding our arms as those changes happen. Anna Beswick of Climate Ready Clyde suggested we need a national heatwave plan, as is mentioned, I think, in the draft, and which England already has, hard though it might be to imagine Scotland require to implement such. Finally, Transport Scotland is currently recruiting chartered engineers who must have an MSc, and it was suggested by Stephen Thompson of that organisation that there would be benefits if we were to introduce the concept of adaptation to MSc courses, be it for engineers or anyone else. What came over loud and clear from the evidence sessions was that, generally speaking, the various sectors do get that they must play their part in adapting to and becoming more resilient to the various impacts of climate change, as they must. I thought David Goodhue of Scottish Fire and Rescue best summed up the way forward when he told the committee extreme weather is not anybody's problem, it's everybody's problem. If we do not take a unified approach with real joined-up working, we will fail. It is a question of partnership, partnership and partnership. Presiding Officer, we require widespread engagement in responding to the challenges we face, and leadership, not just from government. Therefore, the formation of the Public Sector Climate Leaders Forum is welcome, as is the involvement of Claudia Beamish in it, given that we already have the 2020 Climate Group, which is focusing mainly on business. There can be no doubt that we also require exemplar bodies, as the Minister highlighted in his letter to the RACCE Committee, and those need to be from both the private and public sector. There are some good examples out there. I visited the Kingsway campus of the new Dundee and Angus College last Friday and was delighted to learn how that building has been made to rise to the challenge of tackling climate change. A ground source heat pump has been installed, sponsored by Worcester Bosch, and used for training that company's technicians. They have a solar power room, which provides a training facility for students, as well as meeting the energy needs of the building. They're also harvesting rainwater for toilet flushing in the catering block. And through strategically positioned monitors within the building, they're telling students and staff of the performance of these measures, such as the solar power unit, as they aim to create a culture of awareness of the need to save energy and promote renewable energy use. But there is so much more that can be done.
Sarah Boyd. I think the member is making a really useful point about the capacity of institutions to actually give really practical examples of what we can all do. I was wondering if you'd pick up the point about householders and businesses, and I suppose institutions like colleges with significant land where the difference between a concrete surface and a surface with grass, or maybe using plants or trees, could actually have quite a significant impact on minimising flooding.
I think Sarah Boyd makes a very good point, and I don't think there's anything I can add to that. What I would say is there's much more that can be done, as she alluded to, and I would mention particularly local authorities. I'm not convinced, for example, from my own experience or the evidence given to committee, that in the first instance councils are necessarily making full use of existing drainage infrastructure to cope with increased instances of excessive rainfall by virtue of failing to clear gullies as often as they should. In summary, Presiding Officer, this has, I think, been an excellent debate reflecting the importance, the justified importance, Parliament, the Rural Affairs Committee, the Government and stakeholders have placed upon the subject matter. The adaptation programme is a work in progress. On behalf of the members of the committee, can I say we look forward to participating further in its development. I'm sure colleagues would in particular welcome an opportunity to consider further how Scotland is adapting to climate change at some future date once the strategy has been progressed and if parliamentary time allows. In the meantime, I would ask that at decision time members support the motion before them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Day. That concludes the debate on the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee's report on the Scottish Government's consultation on its draft Climate Change Adaptation Programme. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 8673 in the name of Kenny MacAskill on the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Bill UK legislation. I call on Kenny MacAskill to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 8674 in the name of Alex Neil on the Care Bill UK legislation, and I call on Michael Matheson to move the motion.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Matheson. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 8747 in the name of Keith Brown on veterans be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8732 in the name of Rob Gibson on the Scottish Government's consultation on its draft Climate Change Adaptation Programme be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8673 in the name of Kenny MacAskill on the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8674 in the name of Alex Neil on the Care Bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.